Good morning, everyone. I'm Jan Carlos Kucharek, editor of Products in Practice and deputy editor of RIBA Journal. And I'd like to welcome you to our first webinar of 2022 in the PiP webinar series on architecture for housing and residential development. Nice to see everybody out there, whether you're back in the office or still working from home, as I still am. In the last 2 years, if we've learned anything, it's that we've all had time to reevaluate the spaces we live in on a fundamental and at times challenging level. I heard many a story at the outbreak of the pandemic of part one and part two architects spending all day sitting at their desks, or worse, sitting on their beds in tiny flat shares, a reality so grim really that many fell over themselves to get back into the office once they started reopening. I can contrast this with a visit to a recent bespoke home conversion project that will be appearing in PiP next month that makes the idea of home working look like all your Christmases have come at once. I think it's fine when you're master of all you survey, but when it comes to housing, it's up to the architect to make the design decisions that allow those that live in them the flexibility for limited adaptability. That might be hard in an age when the erstwhile Parker Morris space and storage standards seem almost mythical in their generosity, but the skill of the great architect lies in how they can eke out innovative space out of what little they have to play with. True, it probably requires a bit of grit and determination, and nerves of steel to ride such schemes out with clients and councils alike, but when it works, it can be quite something. I remember craning my neck about on the double-decker bus when, unbeknownst to me, I first spotted Sturgis and Bates's 2008 urban villas social housing on London's Seven Sisters Road. It was austere, uncompromising, yet it was somehow absolutely solid. And there was certainly no mistaking it. It was most definitely architecture. And architecture, of course, is the reason why we're all here now. Today, you're going to be hearing from architects and firms who are all award winners in their own rights. They'll be giving us their takes on how they imagine how we might live and the schemes that they present to us with their own interpretations of habitation. Firstly, however, to remind us how mass housing and all building in general needs to be understood in the context of climate change, our opening speaker will be drawing on our attention back to how architects will need to design for more extreme weather. And in a country surrounded by water, where housing pressure apparently makes it necessary to build on low-lying land, how particularly to address through design the increasing likelihood of flooding. Our first speaker then is Ed Barsley. He's founder and director of the Environmental Design Studio. Ed's a specialist in environmental design and architecture, with a particular interest in developing strategies to improve the resilience of communities and the built environment. His practice is an award-winning social venture whose aim is to reduce the exposure of vulnerability in communities and environments to natural or human-induced hazards. They previously won a Sunday Times Resilient Home competition with their design for a home for all seasons. Ed speaks regularly at flood conferences and events worldwide and has been running the RIBA's core CPD lecture series on flooding. Alongside his practice, Ed has been involved with a number of Research Council-funded studies, including his own at Cambridge University, a PhD on flood resilient architecture and risk communication, all coming from someone who lives on a houseboat on the Thames. Ed's also got a YouTube channel, Hazard and Hope, where you can check out his polished delivery of talks on flood resilience. You may not want to know what makes up flood water, but nearly 9,000 viewers did, and there's been nearly 2,000 on how to make your kitchen more resilient, for instance. Ed will be talking today about his new book, Retrofitting for Flood Resilience, a guide to building and community design. And if in the course of it, he's got any ideas about how to become an internet sensation in the meantime, I'm all ears. Ed, are you there?
I am. Hi there, Carlos. Thank you very much. Thanks for a lovely introduction.
Nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone tuning in. I'll just share my screen. We can jump into this, and do let me know if there's any problems and you can't see my slides. Hopefully these will pop up. So thank you again, Carlos, and yeah, it's lovely to be here giving this talk this morning. I'm going to be talking about retrofitting for flood resilience, and flood risk and flood resilient design is a huge topic. And so this is going to be a sort of whirlwind highlights reel of kind of some of the ideas that we could look at within this area. But just in terms of TEDS and the Environmental Design Studio, we look at a variety of different hazards and themes, not just flooding, so also kind of other environmental issues. And we do this through research, design, and delivering a variety of different training around this topic, around these topics and areas. But as Carlos mentioned, I've written a book for the RIBA called Retrofitting for Flood Resilience, a guide to building and community design, which it's quite a few years in the making, and it sort of seemed to keep growing and growing. But I think it hopefully can be a really helpful resource, and it looks at both new build and existing contexts. We were lucky enough to have actually a launch event for it just before the pandemic, and so that was a really special moment and special thing to have. But I mean, within the book, I think one of the key sort of aims and objectives was to try and show the spatial implications of flooding, and to actually bring this topic to life a bit and show some of not just what we should be doing, but actually what will happen if we fail to adapt, and actually showing temporally before, during, and after a flood, so we can start to see that state change, and really actually thinking, I suppose, what the positive things we can do as designers to have a difference, to make that change, and again, alter some of these devastating consequences that we can see here. As Carlos mentioned, I've been running the RIBA training since 2018, really, on flood resilient design. And in the 2021 program, there was, of course, the fundamentals of flood resilient design, which was 2.5 hours long. And even then, it was only really just enough to scratch the surface. So this was in last year's program, but you can still have it as an in-practice lecture, I believe. When we think about what the impacts of flooding can be, as we can see here, we're unfortunately going to see many more communities caught in this state where they're always in a perpetual state of recovery and reinstatement. And as a side point, if you think about the actual carbon and energy that's used to dry out these buildings with dehumidifiers whirring 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and all of the embodied energy in these materials, it's shocking that we're putting things back as they were in a vulnerable state. And so, again, the call to arms, call to action is to think about what can we do as designers to break that cycle and to make a difference, so that we're not creating so much waste and disruption for these communities. And one of the things that we need to think about is actually in managing flood risk, we need to kind of adapt and think at a variety of different scales, which again plays into our hands as designers that can work at a range of different scales. And it's one of the challenges. It's why they call flooding a wicked problem, is that we can't just solve it at any one of these. We need to work at a variety. And so we cover that within the training, and it's covered within the book. But if we think actually about what makes up risk, it's often defined as a function of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability of a system. If we think about vulnerability, that's a function of sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So funny image here of me on the left, cut in half. There's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. Just because something is exposed to flooding or flood water, it does not have to be vulnerable. And that idea is kind of translated over on the other side there with the houses. You can see the vulnerable house and the resilient house. We can reduce the sensitivity of particular materials or increase its adaptive capacity, and the consequences can be very, very different. So we need to think about where the opportunity is to affect that change. Because as that water gets inside, it's not just going to damage the building's fabric, but its contents. Those kitchens are going to be sort of swell and distort, and these are going to become many of the items that we see being chucked into those skips. But there are things that we can do. So there's lots of different things, from wiring your electrics from the ceiling down, and actually specifying particular products and materials that can be less affected by the flood water or can be quickly reinstated. So again, there's a real toolbox of bits and things and strategies that we can think about specifying and using. Within the book, we'll actually look at those different spatial strategies at the property scale as well as other scales, but going in to consider actually ways that we can make a property resistant, recoverable, and also avoidance-based approaches. So avoidance, thinking about reducing that exposure. It could be raising your floor levels. It could be changing your habitable areas, and actually thinking, I suppose, a bit more outside the box in terms of how you might spatially adapt. Now, a key piece of terminology within the flood world, and maybe this is just the one thing that you can take away from today, is that flood resilience is really an umbrella term under which you have flood resistance and flood recoverability. So resistance is about dry proofing. It's holding the water out, trying to prevent that water entry. And recoverability is saying, well, okay, if the water is going to come inside, then what can we do to detail and design the materials so that there'll be minimal damage, and things can be quickly and easily reinstated. Now, it does depend on the property type and the sort of structural performance of the building as to the depth that you can hold the water out to, but you often hear 300 to 600 mil as giving as a guide for resistance measures. Above that, it can be safer to limit the hydrostatic and dynamic loads on the building to just let the water inside and clean it up that way. And with that dry proofing, there's so many different products and materials that we can look at and go through, but there are drop-in temporary barriers, which again, that's 60 centimeters height, that's 600 mil, they're often that height. These can fit in brackets, they can be wound in place, but there's many different flood doors on the market as well. There's even a number which have come through recently that are conservation area friendly flood doors. And again, you normally see the letterbox at that 60 centimeter height so that you're not ending up with 2 meters of water outside your front door. It's sort of, things can balance out if the water gets too deep. So there are a range of products for resistance measures. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but there are also lots of different recoverable products and materials out there on the market to help us wet-proof our buildings. Within the book, we look through at different parts of the properties, and again, as I was saying, really showing the vulnerable setup and the resilient setup. So here you can see what happens to a kitchen and how it gets damaged, and what some of the different options might be to help you adapt. In terms of proof of concept and some good examples, the BRE's Innovation Park in Watford has their Resilient Repair Home, which is a really useful place to check out if you're interested in seeing different approaches and materials out there. They've taken sort of different strategies on different walls within the building, so you can really see, you know, what it's like to have spray applied insulation, bats, different types of membranes, all these things. Useful to see. And within the training and book, we also talk about new build design, new build strategies, and really the sort of mantras within this are thinking that we do not want to increase runoff rates. We don't want to backlog or constrict the conveyance of water or displace it into surrounding areas. So we look through actually what measures you could use, and as Carlos mentioned, this was the Home for All Seasons, which won the Sunday Times Resilient Home competition, and we're moving this forward on a couple of different sites and starting to test this now. And the idea was that it wasn't just resilient to flooding, it was also thinking about how you could be resilient to overheating, extreme cold, energy shortages, and have that flexibility for societal change. Now, just sort of moving through to wrapping things up, I think it's useful to think about these larger scale strategies as well, and actually what you could do to reduce the exposure of a community or a property to flood risk. And within the book, we've kind of framed this within 6 different spatial tactics. So we can attenuate, we can actually use artificial and natural structures to reduce the velocity and turbidity of water, kind of trip it up as it moves through that system. And that's often termed slow the flow. And lots of different natural flood management measures like tree planting, afforestation, leaky dams, all sorts of measures that we can use to help do that. And there's some great examples coming through actually with things like the first climate district in Copenhagen that's being developed with, again, lots of these different SUDS features that can have that attenuation sort of performance and function within it. We can also alleviate, so we can increase the capacity of a water system and make space for water. And we're seeing this on much larger scales with different landscape designs. We see here in China, the sponge cities. So there's areas that are deliberately designed to accommodate that water. And, you know, I think that this is something that we need to look at. And, you know, it's a couple of months ago that London had a flash flood, really heavy surface water flooding. And I think we need to look creatively at how we can create areas to alleviate flood water during those intense periods of rainfall. We can also restrict flood water. And again, this comes with lots of caveats because we don't want to push the problem elsewhere. We don't want to be reliant on the performance of a single threshold. But in certain areas, certain places, there will be the need to restrict that flood water. And see in New York, the BIG are working on the Big U. And this is a kind of inhabited levee of sorts where they've sort of stretched that section and added a variety of different amenity spaces on top of the flood defense, but it's still got that core function of providing protection. And as I mentioned, there's lots of different measures at the property level that we can restrict and dry proof a building. We can also realign, so we can actually think about, you know, actually adjusting and repositioning the properties or even a community, and that could be horizontal realignment or it could be vertical. And we're seeing this on coastal boundaries with managed realignments. The image in the middle there is a community in Italy, actually, that was partially relocated to create space for a reservoir. And on the right-hand side there, that's a building being moved in after Hurricane Sandy in the US. And it's an incredibly sensitive topic and subject to think about realignment. And I think that, you know, it's going to be something that we do need to address and need to face. And there clearly needs to be appropriate community consultation, but I think that it's something that we need to look at in the face of climate change, of how we adapt. And that could be that vertical realignment, as I mentioned. This is a house on the Thames, 5-bedroom detached brick house that flooded. And they actually decided, rather than using barriers, they'd have the property lifted. You can see here they cut holes in the brickwork, an I-beam lattice was slid in, the windows were cross-braced, and then it was lifted by using computerized hydraulic jacks and over a couple of days. This cost £70,000, 70 to 80, and it over doubled the house price. So it went from £1 million to £2 million. And I'm not saying that we should be doing this everywhere, but it's very interesting to see actually what we can do and how we can adapt a property and reduce its residual risk. We can also create and generate new landforms and structures onto which to build. They're building a new island in Copenhagen Harbour, Grenoble Island, which, again, is a new structure within the harbour. Elizabeth Urina's got some fascinating research at MIT on island seeding and actually capturing sediment from natural sediment flow paths to create new landforms. And as Carlos mentioned, I'm working from home today and calling from a houseboat on Eel Pie Island in London, and life on water has been a good experience, and it's a lovely community, and there's lots of different ways that we can live and create new things. And lastly, we can embrace. So we can actually think about how we can make our communities much more water compatible and function with the presence of water. We looked at this in the Shifting Shoreline study, thinking about making a town that was open to the sea but safe from it, and using multi-layered threshold rather than a single line of defense, how we could actually take the energy out of the waves but design the town to function with the presence of water. And this was partially thinking actually about how we can have phased realignment, so how we could inhabit the medium risk zone, but only for a time duration. So that lower level in 2022 might be cafes and shops to begin with, but as levels of risk increase over time, we allow it to gracefully and gradually adapt to the impacts of climate change and sort of roll back. So you've got waste power water up at that first floor level, but we're not locking ourselves into saying everything has to be the same forever. We're allowing that change to happen and that sort of transformation to occur. Now, just a final thing, really thinking actually about a bit of recommended advice for people to pick up on. A crucial thing within this sector, within this industry, is the Code of Practice for Property Flood Resilience, which came out last year. And this, many of you, I'm sure, will see that this process follows similar to the RIBA plan of work. And before this came out, there wasn't really a process for us to follow in designing resilient buildings. And I would say we should all be understanding and getting our heads around this. It's free to download from Syria's website. We've got lots of videos and training around this as well. And there are now sort of resilience ratings being developed for properties, flood resilient buildings. The Code of Practice is guidance at the moment, but I think it will become something that ties into building regs. We do need to get familiar with this because, actually it provides us a rigorous way of working, and it applies to new build as well as existing, commercial, public and residential buildings, and multiple as well as individual properties. So it's a seriously wide remit. Positive things in the industry, just to flag, we're now starting to see resilience being rewarded, and Flood Re from April, I believe, are offering £10,000 for people whose homes have been flooded for them to build back better. So on top of their reinstatement, there's £10,000 for them to put things back in a more resilient way, which I think is really promising. As an aesthetic, it doesn't have to stick out like a sore thumb. It could be integrated into the design seamlessly, but it does need to be recorded. We can't just assume people will know how things are going to work. Otherwise, there's the risk that things could just be ripped out and gutted because they don't know that they're meant to dry out. Things are meant to dry out naturally on the wall. We need to change our mindsets and perceptions of risk. We need to learn to live with residual risk. But as we saw in London the other day, it's quite shocking that people are still thinking they can go swimming in that floodwater when actually these are many of the nasty elements, ingredients that can make up floodwater. And I think as a sort of understanding of risk, we need to do a lot better actually in how it's communicated, and our general understanding of of what flood risk can be, but also how we can design and adapt communities to live safely with this. As Carlos mentioned, the Hazard and Hope series the initiative's been sort of developed over the last couple of years, and we've got a range of different videos that are kind of instructional, educational videos, but we've also got a series of our flood resilient home and business, and they're kind of like a grand designs type of thing, but for flooding really. And I think it's that proof of concept and that kind of real life case study of actually what people have done to adapt, and how Stu, for example, at his bike shop in North Yorkshire, instead of 4 months being shut and closed down, he flooded again. It took him 24 hours to get his business back open. and the actual, the sort of dramatic consequences that adaptation can have, the positive consequences of that change, and how these measures can work. So that's just a whirlwind through a variety of the different elements within this topic. Again, there's so much more detail and depth that we can dive into, but I hope you found that interesting, and very happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was great. Thank you very much indeed. I was kind of intrigued. I remember a house that Hudson Architects did, which I think was in Norfolk, where they'd done precisely that. They'd kind of lifted the building up slightly, but then basically done the whole ground floor. It was a bungalow. They'd done the whole ground floor, so it effectively allowed for the flooding itself. So they had kind of like sacrificial dados. There was a concrete floor with a surface you could just take away. As you said, all the electrics, electrics were kind of came in at high level, and then they were fed down to kind of, 2 meters down. I mean, no, even less, 1.5 meters down from the ceiling, I think. So there's obviously ways where if you build, and they actually become kind of design drivers. Really interestingly, you don't look at them as impediments to your good design. They actually become they become part of the actual design principles, and therefore, he kind of went to town with it and actually ended up with a very beautifully detailed building as a result. Do you think that's kind of a good first way forward, really? You seem to be suggesting.
Definitely. Yeah, and one thing that I often bang on about is context is key, and there's so many different types of flood risk. Each has its own specific characteristics that we need to design for. And so when you're talking about design drivers, if you're in an area that has lots of surface water flooding, that could flood your building in minutes and hours, whereas groundwater flooding could build very gradually over weeks and months on end and stick around. And so the types of measures that we use need to just be very contextual, and so actually it can feed through into our design. And I would say for new build, you'd be surprised. We wouldn't assume that a new build strategy would be reliant on resistance measures from day one and the water's lapping at the front door at day one. Otherwise, it may infer that we've sort of set our thresholds wrong or repositioned the building and positioned the building in the wrong way. But that doesn't mean that we can't design for them to be added in the future. And so I think if we think through at the 20, 30, 50, 80 climate change data sets, and we're looking through at what those future flood levels may be, we need to start looking at the thresholds and datums within our buildings. And as you say, where you're positioning things and wiring the electrics from the first floor down can just be a smart move anyway, to allow for that, to have that adaptive capacity and to know that you're not going to need to gut and rip things out in the future. So there's some stuff that I think just makes sense to take out, to include from the outset. There's so much we could discuss with materials of flood resilient plasterboards and all different sorts that you might only need to put at the lower level of building and use just standard plasterboards above. So there's lots of, I think the interesting thing is how do you get in to dry that element out behind? Like, it's actually a real challenge with the thinking about the detailing and drying and decontamination of some of these areas, because that water is going to find its way into lots of the hard to reach places. And so it's a nice challenge, interesting challenge to have.
We've got a question here from Bob Eden, who's saying, what are your thoughts on improved warning systems that are automatic? I'm not quite sure what he means by, in what regard, I'm wondering.
Yeah, so there are different types of telemetry systems that can alert communities and even properties with almost like a sort of float switch outside your house type of thing, or in your community, that can give you warnings. With things like pumps and sumps, you can also get text alerts, so it'll tell you your pump's just kicked into action, which might be a little bit alarming, but also quite useful to know. There are lots of different flood warnings as well that communities need to sign up for, things like flood line, different ones like that. So there's, particularly with businesses, actually, there's lots of stuff for residential context, but I don't feel businesses often have the same support. And we've released a video recently about creating a business flood plan that we've done with Aviva. And again, having that plan in place and knowing what the evacuation procedure is, what's your grab bag, what staff are going to do which measures, it's really important, because a lot of the time when we've interviewed different people, they've said, oh, the flood warning came and everybody just left to go and protect their houses. And the business was, it was kind of like pick and choose, what are we going to do? There wasn't really a rehearsed strategy in place. So even for many of the architecture firms listening, if you're, where's your server positioned? Where's the data backed up? What's the kind of business continuity strategy in terms of if this whole area gets flooded, what are we going to do? And I saw an example in Sri Lanka, actually, where they wind the computers up into the ceiling at the end of the day. They have these kind of large rigs so that if they flood overnight, things aren't damaged. But yeah, lots of different strategies out there.
I mean, just out of interest, you know, you see these things, kind of communities being affected further up north generally. When a house starts to flood, I mean, you know, when you first start seeing things, kind of trickles of water coming into the door, and then, you know, you end up being kind of like 2 feet deep in water. What's the kind of timeline for that kind of flooding? You know, if you say a river's bursting its banks, I mean, how quickly does it go from kind of dry carpets to 2 feet underwater? I mean, you don't tend to see that. You see the aftermath rather than.
Yeah, I mean, it can be, it'll catch a lot of people off guard. And as I said, there's many different types of flooding. So, you know, we even have flash floods that come from snow and ice melt. You know, that can happen very quickly. If there's a breach in a reservoir, again, that's a quick flood. Storm surges are just going to be coming in. And one of the businesses that we featured within the series, Lisa at the Blue Teapot Cafe in Mythenroyd, actually, she was nearly trapped in her business and was able to be rescued by some people who dragged her out on a fence that they'd managed to get. And so that water rose a lot quicker than she had expected. And there's some interesting kind of depth and risk charts that show it doesn't take much more water moving at high velocity to knock you off your feet. People often think, oh, it's okay, I can swim, I'll survive through floodwater. But you know, when you think of the forces that can be coming through these areas, it's incredibly dangerous. And actually, one of the things we didn't touch on, but with new build properties, there's a lot of focus on actually thinking about safe access and egress. But this is not something that we often discuss or think about with existing communities. So one of the things we've been looking at is how you might retrofit on walkways and safe access for people to move around in particular areas that are going to flood frequently. In Florida, we see sunny day flooding, where it's the high tide just washes through the town. The sky's blue. It's just that with sea level rise, they're now flooding on a regular basis. So it's a question for design, you know, urban designers and all sorts of designers. How are we going to adapt our communities when they flood regularly?
Yeah, I mean, there's a question from Viola Morrison about improved accessibility for high-level buildings. So, I mean, that's the same thing. It's about safe egress and, you know, entrance and egress. And I suppose you've got to look at it,
and I think,
you know, for everybody, you know, in terms of real proper accessibility for everybody.
Yeah, agreed. And I'd say that we don't, because your building might be safe, but if you're having to climb out of your first floor window into a dinghy to get rescued to then be taken off, it's thinking about that. How can you get back to that functional state and have that and maintain occupancy if necessary? But I think we also need to be creative about how we, you know, provide that access, how we landscape it in, how we think about it. And it might be that the flood, you get a warning and the flood arrives within 3 hours, so you don't have time to put duck boards out and to build a temporary structure. And as it is, there could be trees and cars washing down that road. So do you want to be stepping onto a rickety, put together structure? But in other contexts like Venice, you don't have the same velocity of water, and it sort of rises very gradually at times. So you could have structures like that are able to be walked around on. So again, it just hugely depends on the context. But yeah,
it's a massive subject. I mean, clearly, and obviously one that you're covering in your book, which apparently. Retrofitting for flood resilience. Apparently, you'll get 20% discount if you put in the code there. Is that correct, Amber? I'm not quite. Let me just check. Yes, it's a link that's stored on chat, so you'll get 20% discount on Ed Barsley's new book at the RIBA bookshop. Thank you very much indeed, Ed. It's obviously an enormous subject and one that we are probably going to have to deal with more and more, as you say. But thank you very much for giving us that brief rundown. And do check out Ed's website, Hazard and Hope, which is really quite professional in its production values. You've got an amazing opening credits bit. I thought I was watching a kind of a documentary on BBC One. It was great. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Cheers. Our next speaker is one of our sponsor speakers, is coming from Jonathan Lowy of BM Zinc. He's a construction manager by training. He's got 24 years experience working with the material and the company. He's operated in both technical and sales positions in 3 different countries, has an excellent understanding of not only the market, but the technical possibilities of zinc as a roofing and cladding material. He's also involved in technical certifications such as environmental profile declarations, DBA certifications, and fire testing. All of this has been brought to bear on his technical literature aimed at both architects and installers. Before joining VM Zinc, Jonathan worked as a land surveyor in Paris, ironically spending a lot of his time on its zinc rooftops, which is where it all started. Hello, Jonathan. The last time we had a brief chat or a brief exchange on email about our costed page, where you were griping about the fact that you thought the zinc prices were putting in slightly high. So it might be your chance here to redress that with our hundreds of viewers here about how zinc is not as expensive as Gleeds might have thought it was. Good morning.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and good morning to everybody. Yes, I'll just a quick word on costs, because obviously costs are flying up on all materials, including zinc, it must be said. But sometimes zinc does have the image of being very, very expensive indeed. It's not a high cost material. It's a material that actually is, as a over a return of time, is quite cost efficient. But I'll be happy to answer specific questions about that, maybe offline. Carlos, you mentioned Paris, and I was lucky enough to be in Paris just before Christmas, and this was a photo I took out of a hotel room, classic Haussmannian boulevard, with the rooftops of Paris, all of zinc. And as Ed was talking about flood resistance, we're going to be talking a little bit about weather resistance here. The primary reason for using a roofing and cladding material is to keep the weather out, and zinc's no different. It does also have the advantage of being extremely durable. As we'll see, that can be over 100 years, and aesthetically attractive. There's lots of different aesthetics. You do have to make sure that you do the right detailing. One of the requirements for zinc is, for example, it's not a flat roof material. It won't work on a flat roof. It needs a minimum fall of 3 degrees, which is quite low, but it does need that minimum fall. If we can have the next slide, please. We're going to look at a few projects, some examples. Zinc's used for all sorts of buildings, but here we're talking about housing and residential projects. Now, this is a project by Crosby Granger Architects up in the Lake District, and we're just going to run a short film now, which sort of sets the project. It's an extremely attractive setting in the Lake District National Park on Derwent Water. As I said, it's by Crosby Granger Architects, and this is a new build that sits on a site of an old dwelling that was actually damaged by 2015 storms back in 2015. The upper floor is a timber frame, which is roofed and clad with anthrazinc, the very dark grey zinc, using standing seam. But other materials are used: Burlington stone, timber cladding, as well as slate. Slate and zinc are commonly used, and they have been since zinc was first used almost 200 years ago. All of the detailing is also zinc, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail, that some of the valleys, the flashings around the chimneys. But as you can see from this video, the setting is really quite magnificent, close to a lake, in a very, very wet part of the world. I think our video might have stopped there. Try and get it running again. So this is just showing the setting of this magnificent building in an even more magnificent setting. You can see the Burlington stone, the magnificent views, and all of there's some of the other materials, the timber cladding, which is also being combined. Zinc is nearly always used in combination with other materials. This is lots and lots of dark anthrazinc here, but as you can see, the stone and the timber blend really beautifully. Zinc it's not a painted material. It's just zinc, which in this case has been pre-weathered, and it has a fairly natural feel. The actual material doesn't look like paint, which is one of the attractions, and it also makes it very, very durable and very, very low maintenance indeed. Right, so as I said, all of these details are all made of zinc, and I think on the next photo, the next slide rather, we're going to see something about the substrates. Traditionally, zinc has been fitted over timber, and that's the case on this project by, as I said, Crosby Granger, and that's the image in the middle. Both the roofing and the wall cladding sits on a timber ventilated substrate, but warm roofs are becoming more and more popular, where zinc sits on insulation. There's no vented cavity. That gives you an advantage of having an air barrier and better thermal insulation. So on the next slide, here you can see some of the detailing, and I'm just going to run a short video now, which is really aimed more for installers, but hopefully it's going to give you an idea of how zinc is worked. And here comes the video. It's got a voiceover, so I'm going to stop talking for a while.
The G3 ridge is an elegant, low-profile ridge that can be used on both warm, non-vented roofs as well as cold, vented ones. The ridge kit consists of a ridge cap, a connector piece, compression strip, and a colour-coded stainless.
We seem to have the video not running. We've got the sound. Can we get the video running? Is there anybody in the background that can get the video running, possibly? I think we've got the tech guys in the background trying to get this video working, so just bear with us for a couple of seconds. I'm just going to, whilst that's going on, I'm going to talk a little bit about pricing. As everybody knows, prices are going up on absolutely everything. Supply chains are difficult. Concerning zinc, we are also affected. Supply chains are actually quite good, so we're able to supply to ongoing projects with almost no delays at all. A lot of products are in stock in the UK, so it's pretty available. Prices have gone up a little bit over the last 3 to 6 months, but not in the degrees of maybe some of the other materials, timber, tiles, and so on. A zinc roof or wall can generally be fitted for sort of about £150, maybe £200 a square metre, supplied and fitted. It looks like the video, unfortunately, is not working. So apologies for that. We're going to move on to another project, this also in a magnificent setting, but this time in Norway, near Bergen. And this is a project where the architects have created 130 housing units, and there's actually a motorway that runs underneath this development by the lake. And this project uses zinc standing seam, but this time using, rather than the anthrazinc on the last project, something called pigmento grey, which gives it a slightly different grey aspect. And on the next slides, we'll see some of the options again for detailing. We have a master craftsman actually based in Denmark who's a bit of an artist, and he draws quite a lot of details and has got a whole book of details, and here's some of his drawings showing the different options that you can use for the corner detail. There's not one set detail for almost any flashing. There's always options. So moving on to the next slide now. Another project, this time, and actually in another country, this time in France, in Strasbourg, eastern France, near the German border. And this is a retrofit of a residential block. And on the next slide, you can see on the top left there, before, and then on the right, that's the rear, and you can see that the building hasn't been demolished. It's just been pushed upwards, and then the top floors have been clad this time in the middle grey quartz zinc standing seam. Obviously, the geometry has been respected in this block of the adjoining buildings, but the quartz zinc fits in quite nicely with the different materials. Moving on again to another project, this time back in the UK. This is in Woking. This is actually a project which is for over 55s, which is a housing unit, independent living. And I've just realised that I would be able to get into this because I've just become over 55. And this building uses something called Azingar, which is a engraved zinc. Zinc always has a texture, but it's visible. But here we've actually added a physical texture. So when you run your hands over it, there's a texture to the material. And this has been used in shingles, which are primarily for wall cladding, but you can use them again on steep roofing. And on the next slide, you'll see that this building on the right is actually, during the works, required a A1, A2 fire rating. So we couldn't use the traditional timber substrate, but used a galvanized steel deck, which works very, very well indeed. So it's quite possible to have a completely non-combustible substrate. Zinc itself is just a metal, so it's A1. Sometimes coatings that are put on it can move it to A2, but it's A1 or A2. And then on the following slide, we'll see the architects HNW, the architects, and that was the render, and on the bottom the finished building, as I said, in Woking. And then on next slide now, just a little bit. I mentioned the durability of zinc. The BRE indicate 100-year lifespan. There are projects which are over 100 years old with the original zinc. The other advantage is it's completely recyclable. Zinc is never thrown into landfill. It has an economic value and it's recycled, sometimes to make new zinc, sometimes to produce brass and other products with zinc in them, but it's never thrown away. Just to finish on, I want to show a couple of other projects. This is a project that was done by a group of architects, Edgeley Design, Spaced Out Architects, and CKS. On the left in Goodson Street, which is near King's Cross in London. And again, the standing seam's been used, but here using a number of the different finishes we offer. So you can see zinc is always grey, but we can give it a discrete colour, brown, red, green, blue, and slightly different greys as well. So there is that possibility to play on some discrete shades. And on the right, a building actually very, very close to Wembley Stadium, where pigmento red standing seam has been combined with brick. Here again, the zinc is on a non-combustible substrate. We have actually done fire tests for roofing, which even when the zinc is on a timber substrate, it has a no flame penetration or no flame spread following B-roof T4 testing. So on the final slide, there's some information if you'd like to contact us. Obviously, that's been a very, very brief run through, but if you would like more information, please drop us a line, send us an email. But I think I'm going to hand back to Carlos. If you would like to see that video, we can send you a link. So I apologize for us not being able to get that going, but if you'd like to see the video about the installation of some of the flashings, we can send that over to you. Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Apologies about that. We should be apologising about the fact that we couldn't get that video going. I'm sure we had a few gremlins this morning, as you were aware. So apologies about that on our part. But yes, I think the link will be sent through, so everybody will be able to take a view of that, hopefully with their own broadbands working. We seem to be having problems with ours. Thank you very much indeed, John. Azingar, I've always wanted to say, it always reminds me that the last time I read Lord of the Rings, I don't know who produces your names, but that really is quite one. I always think that if I ever write a fantasy novel, that'll be a name for it, for one of the characters. How are you finding? I mean, obviously you're taking a lot of examples out of Norway, Strasbourg. I mean, you did have that kind of How the Other Half Lives house in the Lake District. How much do you do you feel that in the UK we're kind of taking up or embracing zinc? Because obviously it seems like a very French thing, as you say. You worked out in Paris. The Haussmann Boulevards are slathered in it. How do you think UK kind of takes it up?
Just quickly on Azingar, that it's based on the Persian word for zinc.
Oh, lovely.
So that's sort of where that comes from.
There we go.
That's where that comes from. How are UK architects embracing zinc? Well, I would say that they're embracing it a lot. The difference, and I say this to a few people, is that in France, zinc has a very set traditional place. So the mansard roofs of Paris, ornaments. And sometimes French and maybe some German architects don't want to take zinc out of that perceived comfort zone, whereas UK architects probably embrace the material in a more contemporary way and use it maybe in some more interesting designs. So we've probably got a more contemporary mix of projects with zinc in the UK than in markets where zinc is actually more traditional and been used for far more time. Having said that, zinc has been used in the UK since the middle of the 19th century. It's just that it didn't quite take off as it did certainly in France and Germany.
Well, we've got a bit of a slew of questions. I'm gonna put them, all three of them, to you in one go. One question is being asked about the nature of horizontal zinc. John Call is asking, oh my God, it's getting loads. John Call is asking, how do you achieve adequate acoustic performance on roofing to prevent drumming? That's an interesting one. Mike McBride is asking, have you had any problems in coastal environments? And and there's another, yes. Well, can you answer those three?
Well, the acoustic performance, zinc is actually a relatively soft material. It's not like stainless steel. It's not like galvanized steel maybe in a B&Q on a Sunday afternoon when you're doing a bit of getting some DIY kits, and it's also fully supported. So the drumming effect is something that people do consider, but it's never actually a problem. Now, if there are specific things where we need to do a sort of sound studio, that might need to be considered. But the fact that zinc's relatively soft, not soft as lead, and fully supported really eliminates the problem of drumming for all but a few very, very exceptional projects. Concerning coastal environments, zinc's been used for 150 years on lots of buildings by the sea. In fact, it's used on a few Victorian pier buildings. One of them is Clacton, which I've seen for myself. And zinc performs very well in the sea. There can be some staining issues on non-rinse surfaces where the salt lands on the zinc. It's not really a corrosion problem, it can be a staining problem. But on the roofs, it really, really performs extremely well by the sea.
Well, yeah, the horizontal, I mean, I imagine that's a hiding to nowhere, having horizontal standing seam.
Well, I mean, you can have horizontal standing seam on a wall. That's not a problem. So the seams could be vertical or at an angle or horizontal. Yes, you having them on a roof, horizontal, going across the roof, wouldn't really recommend that, because water would pond behind the seams, and that would be, as I said at the beginning, the primary reason for a roofing material is to keep water out of the building.
Yeah.
It's got to look nice and be durable, but it's got to be done in the right way. So on a wall, yes, but not on a roof.
If it's running horizontally, though, would you kind of like tip it down slightly so it kind of obviously?
Well, the seams, when they're actually profiled, they're not quite vertical. They're at a slight. If you sort of look at a cross section of a seam, it has a slight slope to it. It's only 25 millimeters high, so that small height and the fact that it has a slight slope means that water won't pond on it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that was my main issue though. If you had it dead flat, you might end it. It's kind of like sitting, in towards the wall rather than running off.
No, that's not a problem.
I think that's, well, there is in fact another question. Oh gosh. Fire rating responses fire rating in response to non-combustible requirements.
Well, I sort of touched on that, but essentially zinc itself is either A1 or A2, so non or limited combustibility. It does depend on how we treat the surface, but that's not really a problem. We've done the B roof T4 test showing no fire penetration or flame spread. And then for substrates, which obviously are a different matter, so you have to use insulation and substrates which are non-combustible. But by using mineral board and, for example, a galvanized steel deck, that means that you can have certainly an A1 or A2 wall or roof. So there are solutions, fairly straightforward solutions, to make it combustibly fit the requirements.
Non-combustible, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, well, obviously a very interesting talk there. I mean, you obviously kind of piqued the interest of a lot of viewers who had a lot of questions coming on it. So thank you very much indeed, John. Nice presentation. I'm sorry about your video, but I think most of the people were rather beguiled by that Lake District house, actually, so probably didn't care. I certainly didn't. Yeah. I was too busy thinking about that beautiful house. Thank you very much indeed. I'm a bit mindful of the time, so we have to move along. Thank you very much, John. Our next project is Moor's Nook in Woking and is being presented by Steve Jones of Coffey Architects. Steve is an architect leading the studio's delivery of complex high-quality schemes from inception to completion, demonstrating efficient integration of structure and services. He has over 20 years of experience designing award-winning arts, education and leisure projects for leading practices, and has worked with major institutions and high-profile projects such as the London Olympic Velodrome, University of Nottingham and the University of East London. Steve's here to talk, as I said, about Moor's Nook. It's an £8 million residential assisted housing project on a neglected industrial lot in Woking, another project in Woking, Surrey, for a specialist retirement living developer, Pegasus Life. It involves the transformation of a derelict laundry facility into a real community and won the firm a RIBA National Award in the process. You there, Steve?
Yeah, hi, morning. Good morning, Carlos. Good morning, everybody.
Take it away. Hopefully.
Hopefully you guys can see the screen. We good to go? All good?
Yeah, that's great, Steve.
So, yes, thanks for the introduction, Carlos. So this morning we're just going to talk in a sort of case study description of our project in Woking for Pegasus Life called Moor's Nook. Just to really, I suppose, set the scene, the practice was started and founded by Phil Coffey back in 2005, and Phil has a sort of great passion for photography, and he's sort of very talented. It's a selection of some of his photographs. Really, I think the kind of photography and in particular the preoccupation with light underpins and sort of centered in very much all of our projects. And in addition to that, also the connection to the landscape. So building orientation, light and shade, shadow, etc., is sort of considered from first principles on all of our projects. The work really commenced back in 2005, small scale residential projects, and has sort of grown since that time. We still have a range of, let's say, smaller scale resi projects within the office, but the sectors have kind of grown, and we're lucky enough to work with some of, I suppose, the country's leading developers on kind of housing and commercial schemes. The project, Moor's Nook, was actually started quite a while ago now, back in 2015 in January, and the client Pegasus Life at that particular point were commissioning a number of very, very talented design practices, quite often quite young practices, in the kind of formative years, let's say, and the idea was really to try and generate a product that was sort of best in class, that focused on design, but focused on residential living for the over 60s. Almost, I think, coined at that particular time the phrase of the sort of John Lewis in the sector. So our brief for Moor's Nook, as it was in the region of 35 units, about 2,500 square meters. Half a dozen Pegasus Live principles that were identified in a sort of briefing document that was shared with us at the beginning of the project. And in addition to the residential component, there was also a modest amount of communal facilities, a shared reception, a residence lounge and a guest suite, and then on-site parking circa kind of ratio 1:1. The site itself is situated to the west of Woking town centre and to the sort of southern fringe of the village of Horsell. As Carlos had mentioned, the site was occupied by an industrial laundry facility. So the building on the right-hand side, single story at the front, actually had a substation which we relocated as part of the scheme. And here you can see the kind of corner site with a chimney, which I suppose indicates its industrial nature and something that we kind of referenced in a fashion in the design proposals. And then to the right, by the kind of mobile caravan, is the edge of a cricket field with the village of Horsell Moor further to the north. Horsell itself is, I suppose, sort of kind of known perhaps for its connection and Woking itself with H.G. Wells and War of the Worlds, in particular the use and a reference to Horsell Common. The village of Horsell had some sort of moments of kind of quaint architecture. The building on the far right-hand side, Moor's Hatch, was used as a sort of reference point, an architectural touchstone, let's say, with discussions with the planners during the design development of the scheme. Series of slides to follow, which show the incremental kind of placement, key components of the building as they're introduced onto the site. So that the kind of first move was to relocate the substation and to introduce a public courtyard. It's quite a generous offer from a developer perspective. And then aligned with that, we introduced a colonnade, which was an opportunity for both residents and general public to sit and kind of meet. That provides a connection into the main reception. And then that main reception has a visual connection both to the public courtyard, but also to a private south-facing courtyard. And then we situated up at first floor level a communal lounge, which itself was sort of embedded in the kind of overall kind of architectural composition, rather than being as it may be ordinarily at ground floor level, and certain residents would feel sort of dislocated from that. And then in terms of the architectural form, which was sort of built around that party, we have a series of two-story gable-ended parts of the building which relate to the adjoining Edwardian and Victorian Street. So they're kind of two-story, and the scale itself then is introduced and increased as one moves north towards the cricket field, giving these sort of fantastic views north back towards the village itself. This is a site plan. Here you can see, my cursor, the cutout on the top right of the plan, showing the public courtyard and the relocated substation. The horseshoe plan, horseshoe-shaped plan with open south-facing courtyard. And then a ground floor plan set in context. Hopefully you'll be able to see here in number 3 the entrance colonnade, which then brings you into a host area and connected into a guest suite, and then with views back into the central courtyard, with car parking situated to the kind of finger of land to the rear of the site. All of the apartments are dual aspect. That's something that we're super keen on as a practice, really. Wherever possible, we'd always seek to try to achieve that with multi-residential schemes. You'll see at first floor level here we have the communal lounge, which itself has this dual aspect nature, both into the private courtyard, but back out towards the public space and the streetscape beyond. And then a cross-section of the building through that south-facing courtyard, showing how the building increases in height as one moves away from the existing dwellings on Horsell Moor towards the cricket field. One sort of notable kind of component of the scheme here, you see on the section clearly, is the opportunity to enjoy the roof space. We managed within this design and build procurement process that the project was delivered to avoid introducing a ceiling here. So the top floor flats, all of the top floor flats enjoy this additional height and light. All of have sort of zenith light through roof lights themselves. You'll see on a series of completed photographs and some further studies to follow, there's a very deliberate relationship of roof edge to kind of built form, both to the street. As you can see my cursor on the right hand side of the long section or the cross section, where the eaves are clipped, and then when one comes into the courtyard, where we're creating a sort of private, more communal and community-based space. To bring down the scale, we have projecting decks and roofs to provide a slightly more kind of intimate and to generate kind of threshold spaces. All of the apartments are entered from within the central courtyard via our own front doors. There are front doors to the street, to Horsell Moor, with sort of modest little garden spaces to allow residents to enjoy the morning sun. It's east facing, to have their sort of cups of coffee or kind of breakfast out there should they wish. In terms of materials, so we try to, as a practice, keep and limit the materials to a minimum, ideally natural materials that will kind of patinate over time. Unfortunately, John, we didn't use VM zinc on this one. We used Rhine zinc. It's a sort of natural zinc roof, pre-weathered, a sort of blue-grey, and that sits atop a brick facade. We used 2 bricks, a multi-brick by Freshfield Lane and a dark grey brick as a base. The idea of the base material really is to accentuate the entrance area and also to give a sense of the kind of spatial arrangement of the building within. One thing that's worth noting is the chimney as a sort of vertical element in the grey brick, and the intention is that to be read when one is inside the communal lounge at first floor level, which you'll see on some of the later slides. Windows are Velvac, composite aluminium and timber, and we have some elements of curtain walling as well to the main entrance stair, which looks back into the central courtyard space. In order to articulate the brickwork, we had some very healthy conversations with Woking Borough Council. We looked at a whole series of studies of projecting bricks. It's actually a Flemish bond, and we projected the brickwork to itself reflect the various flat arrangements within the plan. One of the pre-planning visuals, actually, this was prior to the textured brickwork being introduced. This is a sort of record of a board that was submitted for planning materials discharge, which shows the kind of key components, the brick and the different metal finishes. Inevitably, during the course of the construction process, we were innovated as architects. There were some changes to the colours, which will be apparent in the photographs to follow. Commencing here, so this is a view along Horsell Moor. You can see the terrace of the street beyond at the far left-hand side of the image. The building is sort of slightly set back, and then the building height increases as one moves north. You begin to get a sense of the textured brickwork, which is really sort of very, very effective. The entrance colonnade on the right-hand side with bench seating situated within that. A view from a walkway that takes you over the Basingstoke Canal as one approaches the site. Again, giving a kind of sense of the increasing scale as one moves towards the corner of the plot, where the building raises to its sort of highest and greatest height, to create a kind of sort of civic presence on this quite prominent site, really, opposite the cricket pitch. And then sort of an oblique view, somewhat of a close-up of the Moor's Nook facade that shows how effective, really, the projecting bricks are. They only project by, I think it's circa 20 millimeters, the projecting headers, but they do give this rather lovely textural appearance and help animate the brickwork and accentuate the flat sections of Flemish bond as well. Just quickly, in terms of roof finish, we were encouraged as the point of innovation to consider an alternative to the Rhine zinc. roof, which was suggested by the contractor to follow a VIO, which is a steel-coated roof finish. We were actually supported by the local planning authority very, very strongly that they were keen not to move away from the Rhine zinc. It was considered a very high quality material and something they were keen to retain in the delivery of the project. So hats off to the planners, really. They were very supportive and strong-minded and resisted the contractual changes, and we managed to continue with the Rhine zinc roof. And just a couple of close-up photographs here showing what a really beautiful material it is, really very sort of highly finished, lots of kind of bespoke details. This is to the external edge of the building, the clipped eaves, the more kind of civic side of the building. Freeman's, the subcontractor, did a sort of fabulous job working with our team and the contractor to develop these details. And just a series of images now, some of which were our own design development, looking at the courtyard. As one moves towards the building, you get a sense just through the glazing of the single staircase in the building. It just pokes its sort of nose beyond the end of the wall and kind of gives a sign and signal as one approaches the public space to the right-hand side, places to sit. Inevitably, during the course of construction and the pressures of design and build, there have been some changes. I think the architecture is sufficiently kind of strong to allow those to not have sort of significant negative impact on the scheme. We still end up with these rather sort of beautiful spaces for relaxation and contemplation. Photographs worth noting were taken very much at the completion of the building, so prior to habitation. The communal study staircase, again, this is at the sort of design stage that informed our contract documents. There were some changes, as you'll see in the following photographs, that developed the proposals through to construction. But the integrity of the kind of scheme and the party still exists. Slightly different kind of coloration on the timber, but nevertheless, the detailing is still very, very elegant and very, very kind of crisp and calming. And here we brought the brickwork in from the outside into the inside, so you get this connection between inside and outside, both sort of physically and visually, which follows up to the communal lounge elevated at first floor level with a brick enclosure to the fireplace. The fireplace on the obviously inside face of that chimney to the external elevation, so one is able to locate oneself within the building, within the plan and within the whole. And then from that communal lounge, one also has this view back into the south-facing courtyard with a deeper terrace that allowed for cafe seating to be introduced. And the internal courtyard and roof detailing, as I'd mentioned earlier, sort of deliberately developed to create moments of sort of intimacy and threshold on the right-hand side. A study here looking at the front doors into the ground floor apartments, introduction of window seats, textured brickwork, threshold spaces, and some photographs of the completed building prior to the landscape sort of flourishing, which it has given its south facing, and it's really has matured quite beautifully since. But you can here begin to see the various layers and levels, and also get a sense of how the deck access and projecting roofs provide moments of kind of shade and kind of threshold into apartments. All of the windows are full height, so the flats, the apartments are flooded with natural light. All of the roof apartments have roof lights as well. And then the detailing is sort of very, very, very crisp, and kind of modern light fittings are introduced within the depth of the balustrading itself. The thin balustrading allows one to both create a sense of sort of enclosure when looked at obliquely and then openness when looked at on a perpendicular angle. And here you can see how successfully this sort of wave-like roof begins to connect into the existing streetscape of the residential properties beyond. Just very quickly to talk about the apartments themselves. There's 34 apartments in the finished completed building, 21 two beds, 13 one beds. The two beds have this sort of, I think we call it a pinwheel plan, where we have bedrooms that are diagonally opposite one another. As I mentioned earlier, apartments of dual aspect, and then the living and kitchen dining spaces are located diagonally across from a sort of central core area, which contains bathrooms and utility room. And in our studies at the time, sort of early design studies, we were very keen to develop sort of our, I suppose, preoccupation and sort of experience from residential projects to develop that and that kind of aesthetic and detailing into the apartments themselves. And this is sort of an image of one of the ground floor apartments looking back into the courtyard space, and the kind of look and feel that we thought was appropriate. I mean, interestingly, and it was very much a lesson that we learned during the course of the project. Pegasus Life, who are now part of the Life Story group, are very sort of aware of their kind of market, and therefore were very keen to establish a kind of control and a strong direction in terms of the look and feel of the interiors, which kind of became sort of something that was a little bit kind of softer and more attuned to their kind of market, a market which they knew and understand very well. So this is a kind of photograph that's taken from one of the marketing suites on site, looking back into that central courtyard space. But just a sense of the apartments when they're finished. This is the roof space apartment, huge roof lights, flooded with natural light. And then again on the opposite side of the building, east facing, looking back towards Woking town centre, dual aspect, lots of natural light, and I think as Carlos had mentioned, we were lucky enough to win an RIBA national award last year, and taken from the kind of judges and the jury's citation, little quote on the right hand side: "There's a real sense of well-being here, and at no point do you discern this is a scheme designed for over 60s or for any demographic for that matter. Quite the opposite, the architectural principles applied to such good effect have created a wonderful place to live regardless of age." So hopefully that was a kind of a useful, perhaps rather hasty run through the project. Please feel free to ask any questions, perhaps in the chat.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. Thank you very much, Steve. I'm interested really in the. Can you tell me? I mean, I had an experience of going around a few of these kind of like residential living things with my mum actually a couple of years ago. Not to the Pegasus Life standard. I mean, they really do seem to have developed a niche there. Can you tell? Are your flats actually? Because my problem was with a lot of them was that the ones I went into were single aspect, and I really couldn't bear that. And it took me a little while to convince my mum that wasn't really. But the idea of you seem to talk about double aspect here. Are they all double aspect, these flats?
Yeah, they're all dual aspect. And in fact, I think there's ones on the corner that are actually triple aspect. They're all dual aspect.
Oh, okay. Oh,
yeah,
right.
Yeah. And I mean, the residents, we've been back since the building was completed, to take kind of various parties around the building, and I mean the residents really do, it's really warm to the building. Residents talk about get up in the morning, have their kind of breakfast on the kind of east kind of facing side, come into the courtyard in the afternoon and the evening. There's very much a sort of gathering of residents, a real community feel around the communal lounge as well, which is sort of wonderfully positioned on that sort of elevated point with a connection.
Yeah, I
both into
was
that
going to
private
ask about
courtyard.
that too, because I found those spaces deeply problematic. Those because if they're designed badly or designed without real thought,
Yes,
they are just effectively dead space. That was my experience. I just thought, who occupies these spaces? How do you encourage people out if you're not actually giving them a reason to get out there? So I was actually very interested in the fact that for a start it was dual aspect, but also because I think those kind of spaces, they are offered, they are part of the the offer by the organisation, and they need to be used. I think otherwise they're just dead spaces, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the communal lounge is immediately adjacent to, there's only a single stair in the building and lift, and it's immediately adjacent to that. So you have to walk past that on your way to your apartments. It's very, very much sort of centrally positioned. And the fact that it's elevated as well gives you this sort of wonderful terrace view back into that courtyard. So yeah, I think it's very, very successful, and it was a very, very good move elevating it up to that first floor. There's a guest suite at ground floor level. Should any of the residents have visitors coming that want to stay with them, but no, it really is. It's really, really, really lovely.
Magda's got a thing here, or question here, saying, "What's the ownership model of the scheme?" I managed to finally put my mum off actually by telling her that I just didn't think it was appropriate. Really, I didn't think the quality was good enough. But you're
not talking about our scheme there, Carlos.
No, absolutely not. But I did. I mean, there's always been an argument about really how do you hold. I mean, my argument was ultimately how do you hold validity of these things, because obviously there is an ownership model. Being retirement living, there's a limitation to the kind of people to whom you're then reselling back to. So obviously Pegasus Life are trying to kind of maintain or hold or increase value of their assets, ultimately, I'm assuming, given their concentration on design quality.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's if you consider the market that they're aimed at, they're often, it's sort of people who are downsizing from in this location, Woking, from a 4-bedroom house with a large garden that's become too kind of large for them. So I think it was important to Pegasus Life to provide both a place to live that had sort of high quality finishes, but also had a kind of community at its heart. And I think it must be quite a kind of change for people to go through to have to make that move to downsize. And Pegasus, I think, were very, very good at and are very good at creating an offer that encourages people to make that change. I mean, it's worth pointing out that for Woking, our project was the lowest of their kind of budget, the Pegasus budgets. They've got much higher budgets in places that are perhaps slightly more premium in terms of their location. They've got projects in Hampstead and the like as well. But I still think it's a very attractive offer.
Yeah, it's got some really. I mean, it's got lovely kind of like filigree detailing. When you talk about the balustrades, the nature of the brickwork, how you've used the Flemish bond, how you've kind of got the. There is real kind of quality in the build there. Yeah. I'm kind of interested in where you kind of made concessions. I mean, we've got to finish up quite soon, but I noticed one picture you had of the courtyard, of your kind of ideal view, and then the finished thing, and there was kind of your columns. So instead of kind of like the brickwork soffit running along from column to column, you had the kind of the soffit of the courtyard kind of moving in. So it was less, basically there was just kind of like a thin skin on the edge of soffit brickwork. How much did you feel the kind of the design and build, the final design build contract kind of compromise your decisions on that? Because it does look highly finished. I mean, I'm picking up something that I just noticed, but actually the general quality seems quite high.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think the sort of, I suppose, the design concept, there's a sort of strength to the scheme in terms of its sort of layout, the notion of the clipped eaves externally, projecting eaves internally to create that kind of intimacy. I suppose the hits from design and build, I think, were relatively minor. I mean, you kind of perhaps picked up on one. Soffits, we had soffits which were all brickwork. I think they changed to metal in that entrance colonnade. Yeah. And there's an entrance into the car park as well on the kind of south side of the building as well, which had a brick soffit at sort of contract stage that got sort of whittled away. But I think generally speaking, it's and as you say, the character, the Flemish bond, we managed to hold on to. There were cost savings, as there often are, offered throughout the contract, for changing to stretcher bond. But I think the client stood firm and took our advice, and I think it's paid dividends.
Yeah, no, Dave Jones here just had a comment. Great to have such large windows, full height, so people can see even when sitting. I mean, really key as well. I mean, those kind of things, those details are really, really important as you're getting older. The idea that you are more sedentary and that you want to kind of enjoy views without having to sort of like peep over a sill level. So really beautifully done. I mean, a well-earned award there, and a lovely development. I'm sure it's completely full, I would assume.
I think it probably is, yeah. I'll put my name down on the waiting list.
I'm not so far off myself. Congratulations, Steve. Lovely job. Sorry
Thanks,
to cut you
Carlos.
off. There were questions there, but we managed to get a couple in. Thank you very much indeed for your time. And we need to move on now to Oscar Acoustics. Generally, we have Ben Hancock giving presentations on this one, the managing director of the firm. For one reason or another, which I'm not quite clear, he's not available to be here today. So we're going to be seeing, we're going to be watching one of their videos. So I don't quite know how we run that. Richard, are you there? Are we running this now?
Oscar Acoustics ISO mount soundproofing brings professional-grade noise insulation to everyday homes, giving your customers the freedom to be themselves. Indulging in that hobby they've always wanted to try. Or simply enjoying a few moments of peace and quiet. All without disturbing the neighbours or each other. And best of all, it's simple. But how does noise transfer between floors? Sound passes through ceilings and floors as vibration and emerges as sound pressure waves generated by footsteps, music, or voices. These penetrate and travel through floorboards, joists, and ceilings in the form of vibration and noise. How can you significantly reduce this noise? By creating an isolated floating ceiling using our Oscar IsoMount acoustic hanger range. You will stop the vibration that causes the transfer of unwanted noise between floors. There are 3 types of IsoMount hangers. Type 1 for joists. Type 2 for installation where plasterboard ceilings can't be removed, for example in listed buildings, or under concrete. And Type 3 for joists through plasterboard or into concrete, with height adjustment for level ceilings. Type 2 comes with extensions for deeper voids, and they're all equally easy to install. It's all done from the room below, and installation is fast, simple, and cost-effective. With Type 1, the minimum of ceiling height is lost, it's height adjustable, and it's safe. With a fire rating of up to 90 minutes where required, IsoMount complies with British building regulations for airborne and impact sound, and provides class-leading acoustic performance without the hefty price tag, giving your customer a simple, safe, and affordable route to peace and quiet.
There are many companies offering solutions to reduce or eliminate noise, so why choose Oscar Acoustics? Well, we have a long history of providing acoustic and soundproofing solutions. In fact, we've been doing it for over 40 years, so it's something we really understand. In that time, we've become one of Britain's leading companies in the sector. We have custom solutions for every building, from offices, educational, to entertainment venues and hospitality. Our wealth of experience and compliance record is something we're very proud of. And we're also proud of IsoMount, our own high-performance soundproofing system for ceilings. British-made and space-saving, IsoMount has revolutionised noise transfer reduction. Talk to us today, and we'll help you find the best solution for your project design and budget.
Okay, Carlos, when you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. That was rather abrupt end there to the first half. I was going to say I was going to get Ben Hancock on the blower and actually get him over to my gaff, because sometimes it feels like I'm living in a tea chest. Interesting stuff on sound transfer. Obviously, yes, something we all have to deal with. Me not least. Our next presenter today is Dave Dickerson of DK Architects. Dave's got over 20 years experience of high quality project delivery of all scales and complexities, including community-led regeneration schemes, multi-million pound mixed-use developments, and he's recently completed Gables project in Crosby, recipient of a RIBA National Award last year. He regularly speaks on the importance of design quality and housing to industry and local authorities. The Gables, which he's talking about, is a new high-quality 30-home development for FP homes, where careful repetition of form and distinctive detailing across the differing unit types builds a strong scheme identity. The project utilises a redundant former factory site, delivering more appropriate use within what is primarily residential area of Crosby. Are you there, Dave?
I am, yes. Thanks, Carlos. Thanks for the introduction.
Good morning.
Morning. I'll just try and share my screen now. I think we have a technical issue. It's not allowing me to load my slide deck up.
Hi, Dave. Do you want to try that one more time?
It's still saying I'm only a guest user who can only load 2 slide decks. So it's kind of assuming I've got one logged in.
Okay, do you want to try sharing your screen?
It has appeared now, actually, Richard.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Dave.
Okay, great. Okay. Apologies for that. Yeah, obviously, thank you for the invitation to speak this morning. So, yeah, my name's Dave Dickerson. I'm a director of DK Architects. We're a practice based in Liverpool, and we work broadly across the north and historically as far south as Kent. We work across a range of sectors, but kind of do have a specialism in residential architecture, and that tends to be across a full spectrum of kind of scales and types, really, from pretty complex urban regeneration master plans like this in Leeds that we're currently delivering, through to all sorts of open market sale from landmark buildings through to lower rise developments. We work for housing associations on large master plans, gritty urban infill sites. We've delivered a number of specialist extra care schemes, and we also deliver one-off houses of quite varying shape, scales and budgets, really. Before I launch into kind of talking specifically about the Gables, and there's probably a couple of bits that I sort of wanted to kind of point out, which kind of underpin how we approach things, really. This statement that's on the screen, conservation areas of the future, is one that kind of I heard like a number of years ago and actually resonated quite a lot with me, because it kind of talks about what do we think as designers and developers and deliverers of residential architecture we're leaving for future generations, and what do we think is going to be perceived in with the same level of respect and quality and pride that we look back onto the better examples of housing from our past, really. And particularly at a time where housing demands are like enormous in terms of numbers to kind of be hit, I think it's important that we try to maintain the quality amongst that drive for quantity, really. That's then also wedded into the whole principle of obviously the biggest issue that faces the world in terms of the kind of green agenda, and making sure that we're using our best endeavours to create places and spaces that people love and want to kind of retain, really, and to form those sustainable communities in the first place. We think as architects, kind of our principle should be to attack everything with kind of passion and quality, and to try and deliver the best goals kind of on every project, really. But definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, our best schemes come where it's not just us who are driving that kind of quality, but there's a shared kind of commitment from all, and that's kind of from wider stakeholders, including like local authority planning departments, through to clients and end users who perceive the benefit in sort of chasing kind of quality really, and the uplift in quality that kind of and value that kind of creates. The Gables is a pretty perfect example of that from our perspective, and obviously it's gone on to win a kind of few national and regional awards, which is kind of great. Equally, hugely well received by our client, who is a developer, and most importantly, the end users, who are kind of the residents who kind of occupy those houses really. And there's a very interesting video that Housing Design Awards did sort of last year, where they interviewed a few of the residents, and they spoke quite glowingly about the kind of the opportunities that these houses kind of gave them. They didn't imagine would be possible within their kind of budget and their kind of their style of life really, which is pretty rewarding. So I think, interestingly, the image that's kind of on the screen at the moment is a CGI that we produced during the planning process to try and engage others at this point, kind of the planning department, about how the composition of the scale, density, massing, landscaping, kind of detailing was all kind of coming together to create what we hoped would be a better environment because of all those things. And what's really rewarding for us is when we look at the completed photos, not a single kind of part of that's kind of been lost throughout kind of the whole design evolution and through all of the RIBA kind of work stages. And in some cases, quality has been added kind of each of those points kind of really. As I flick through a few photos, what we obviously delivered is a development with a very strong brand identity, a very clear character that's very different to kind of surrounding kind of housing developments. But interestingly, within this rigor and this kind of repetitive kind of form, there's actually kind of 12 house types there, which kind of range from 2-bedroom apartments all the way through to kind of 4-bedroom houses, and also between social rent, shared ownership, and open market sale, kind of all in a completely holistic kind of seamlessly blended fashion, really. Now, we were not the first architects to kind of look at the site, and our client wasn't the first developer to try and bring this forward. In fact, the site immediately to the south of this slide was owned and developed out by Bellway Homes, who sought to try and acquire this site and take it forward. They couldn't get the commerces of it to kind of sit together through various kind of complications that exist with the site. And interestingly, that's because of the approach, I think, because what we did when we looked at it was to take a very different stance on it, and not just kind of lay it out in a very standard housing type, ask what actually does this site kind of offer, and how can we best take kind of, or make best use of the kind of the constraints and the overall dimensions and the properties that the site kind of has. And the absolute key element in all of that was introduction in the centre of the site of these back-to-back courtyard houses, which at the time that we were designing those were kind of pretty revolutionary. They've been kind of since used kind of quite a bit around the rest of the country, but they were a very sort of different model and kind of came with their kind of own challenges, really. The site itself is, I would guess, normal of most kind of suburban extensions to kind of main cities. Crosby is an area about 5 miles north of Liverpool. The site is great in that it occupies a sustainable location. There's great transport links to the local and wider networks. There's a range of amenities and benefits in the area, but there certainly isn't anything of great kind of character or quality there that you would kind of look to build upon to sort of create a character or a definition for the site, really. The vast majority of the surrounding houses is kind of like sort of 1930s kind of semi-detached houses, so a huge dominance of kind of 3-bedroom sort of semi-detached properties. The immediate context, you can just see our development sort of in the background there, is the Hawthorne Park development by Bellway Homes, which is just a very typical speculative house development, really. So the fact that our client was willing to engage with something really quite different and to challenge those norms was hugely kind of rewarding and beneficial. And I think we kind of maximized that viewpoint, really. The site itself was about as tricky as you could sort of hope to be, really. There was surrounding non-residential uses, a political will to retain those non-residential uses because of employment benefits, etc. Outlook was kind of poor. The original site was occupied by an asbestos kind of tin shed kind of factory, so huge kind of remediation complications within the site. Every boundary was a complication in terms of either amenity issues with the adjacent recently developed Bellway Homes scheme, overlooking onto kind of builders, merchants, working factories. There was air quality and acoustic issues. So a pretty tricky site as kind of far as it goes. And in some ways, some of those constraints led to the final kind of layout of the site, which is certainly in our view, much more insular and inward looking than most schemes that we kind of work on, which kind of seek to knit together kind of areas of kind of infrastructure. So just returning for context back to that typical response that others had kind of sort of looked at. Our scheme was obviously very clearly very different, and the massive increase in density, which kind of raised the scheme from around 19 units up to 30 units, increased the density from 28 dwellings per hectare to 44, which is very, very dense when you consider it's got virtually 200% parking and kind of all the amenities of private garden spaces, etc. The means by which we did that was to address everything kind of very holistically as a design. So kind of every element of the overall kind of scheme played its part in making interfaces work, in making amenity levels work, in making neighborhoods and sort of lights kind of work, really. So starting from the public-private realm spaces, we wanted to try and build a sense of openness, but equally not to recreate some of the issues of the past where kind of lack of demarcation of public and private space wasn't clear, really. So we kind of worked very hard to kind of look at how we design a public realm that gave us the sense of a space and a place rather than a streetscape, but equally dealt with all of the complications of modern life, of car parking, bin routes, etc. And that afforded us some great possibilities. We looked at a very detailed highway design, and that allowed us to bring areas of planting out. We did quite a lot of tracking work to kind of really narrow that carriageway, or the shared surface space, I should say, down as far as possible and create an environment rather than just a bland street. Massively important was the scale and massing of the overall development. Because we were making an incredibly dense scheme, and not only were we increasing the number of units, we were actually increasing the coverage, i.e. the square footage of each kind of unit on there as well. So we kind of, hopefully what's apparent is the diagram there. We look to kind of, the red indicates 2.5/3 story, the orange is 2 story, and the yellow kind of shows 1 story elements. So we worked really hard to define those houses and to create a rigor and a rhythm which allowed light to kind of enter the kind of otherwise deep plan zones that each of those kind of houses have. And that was massively instrumental because it allowed us to raise the scale, which hopefully is apparent in the image there, of our dwellings in terms of moving away from that 2.3 meter high kind of spec house builder kind of squat feel of the houses. We raised the ceiling height, so we had like 2.7, 2.8 meter ceilings, which just took it back to a slightly grander kind of feel and scale, which then really reinforced that need to make us work very hard in terms of defining the light and making sure we got light into each of those areas. And I think that's pretty apparent on all of the images, that we created this sense of air and space between each of the houses, which the single story kind of terraces did for us, really, but also gave us another type of external space for kind of the residents and opened up this possibility of achieving dual aspect units and getting the light deep into the plan of the houses. Similarly, boundaries and landscape played an absolutely huge role in this, because we have houses very, very closely, tightly packed together. And we've created really nice large windows to create that light and airy feel in those dwellings. What we didn't want is for that to effectively become almost an Achilles heel for the development, really, and end up with kind of blinds and curtains everywhere because everyone feels the loss of privacy. So we very clearly articulated different boundaries, different boundary heights, different types of boundary, so that different windows had different levels of protection. And we used things like key planting, like specimen trees, to basically soften those views through the windows so that nobody felt their privacy was invaded, and that sense of openness of the windows and the light could sort of be maintained sort of across the development. I think the landscaping equally we considered from a nighttime perspective as well. So because this ended up as a private road, so non-adopted, it afforded us a number of opportunities in terms of signage and street lighting, which we wouldn't have otherwise had, and which we kind of captured to make the most of the feeling of place, really. I sort of mentioned kind of briefly earlier that anybody who delivers residential architecture knows that kind of the two key aspects which kind of can have a huge negative impact on housing are probably bin storage and cars, vehicles. So you will have to just believe me that the photo at the top, which is shot from the Bellway development, which is a much looser development with larger areas, sort of clearly shows that issue where the misuse of pavements and parking and the dominance of the car in the streetscape becomes like absolutely apparent, massively more so because the open plan frontages, the lack of boundaries mean that vista is kind of uninterrupted along the streetscape. So, so from that aspect, we kind of very specifically set around kind of laying out the car parking as an integral part of the public realm design. So again, bit of a poor photo, but you can see this is shot from inside the development now, looking back out towards the Bellway scheme, showing that the car, and it was tried to be taken to show the cars as much as anything, but they're very clearly kind of discreetly hidden behind walls and using boundary treatments to kind of prevent them from impacting on the feel of the public realm. And to date, that's been massively well kind of respected by everybody who kind of lives there, really. The houses themselves were interesting. This is not an expensive scheme. This is not in a hugely high value area. So we were kind of very restricted in terms of what we could and couldn't do. So we had to be very careful with how we spent the money and how we achieved the maximum impact from kind of our design decisions. So key for us was the selection of a couple of very nice bricks. So Wienerberger, Colmosso, BEA's, Old Colford, to add like texture and quality and a tactile sort of feel to the scheme. And then we worked to kind of produce a few key details which we repeated on every house type so that we could kind of build some economy of scale. So the developer didn't feel he was reinventing the wheel at every single kind of house type, really. So kind of, again, we were limited to UPVC windows because of the development budget, but by using the dual aspect kind of rooms, we were able to remove all the clutter, the transoms, etc., the opening lights, and kind of allow a much more seamless kind of aesthetic onto the front elevations with these large kind of slab windows, and working really hard with a couple of really key details, the camp brick head and some really deep overhangs, which we employed internally to make some shelving recesses. So everything was kind of fulfilling a bit of a function in terms of the plan as well as the aesthetic intent. Then the final kind of point of the sort of the outward design was these camp windows, which created a very different character for the development and also created a very different character and feel inside the kind of the upper floor areas. The house types themselves, there's many and varied, but I'll just sort of highlight a couple kind of quickly. Focus again on a few key details, putting the money probably where it did the most work for kind of the final end users of the scheme. So kind of at the foot of the stairs, instead of a couple of doors, there's 1.5 meter wide sliding screens there that can be pulled back or left closed depending on how people want to inhabit those spaces. So you can have an open flowing space or a more cellular space, and the use of the first floor terrace to kind of really change and add kind of a different dynamic to the external spaces. And you can see from the front living spaces and bedrooms that dual aspect that was managed to be achieved by the kind of the articulation of the massing and the facades, really. So the absolute kind of final point would be the back-to-back courtyard houses, which were kind of clearly sort of the main aspect that made the whole kind of scheme work. Now, because they have historically had a bit of a bad press, we kind of worked exceptionally hard to make these not feel like that. So these are almost very normal family houses, but just considered in a very different way, really. So I think if I illustrate this on the 3D, you can just see in the middle there, this kind of axonometric kind of sketch is kind of showing 6 back-to-back houses and then a cutaway kind of on the last one, really. So if I highlight, the red line shows the demise line of a single house, with the blue now kind of illustrating the massing of that individual house with its front street access, dual aspect, the bedroom, the single story terrace and roof terrace, and the kind of 2-story massing, which allows the manipulation of all those things allowed light into each of the garden spaces. So you end up with a very normal front garden, a private front garden behind like a boundary wall, which is made to feel part of the street scene. And then this added bonus of the kind of the external terrace and first floor, which again, I would refer you on to the Housing Design Awards video, where one of the residents spoke kind of amazingly glowingly about the fact that her and her daughter were able to sleep out there kind of like during lockdown, and so the feeling that gave them of a type of house and an experience they never expected to kind of achieve really within their budget. So thank you. That was kind of the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much indeed, Dave. It's a really, the first time I saw this project, when it was kind of like you'd submitted it for the RIBA awards, and I was looking at the photos, I was actually more struck because, you know, the building is kind of a type. I've seen things, you know, similar kinds of buildings. What really struck me was the external landscaping, because clearly you spend all the money on the building, you run out of money towards the end of a project, of a development project, and you know the thing that suffers is the external, is the kind of the public realm. And it felt to me completely different. The first thing I saw was the kind of the neatness and the considered nature of that public realm. It struck me more in a way than the buildings themselves. And I mean, I'm just really intrigued as to how you managed to do all of that for 50. I mean, people have been asking here, what did this cost? Well, you know, what the submitted figure was £1,500. You did caveat that with the fact that it was a builder developer. But that aside, how did you kind of manage to keep the developer on side with things like, you know, effectively public realm, which I'm sure that, you know, most builders probably don't really think about. They're too busy thinking about the project of the home rather than what the hell's going on the road outside.
Yeah, no, great. Well, there's obviously a series of questions in there, isn't there? I think I suppose the starting point is, yeah, I kind of, in some ways, although it's a little bit crazy for a practice of architects to say, the buildings kind of are secondary, aren't they? Kind of like, when we approach things, we kind of think about the life and space, and then the buildings kind of are the end point of that, because the impact of the public realm is astronomically more than the detailing, say, of the building or the form of the building. So that, we'd sort of made that kind of like very clear that was like an absolute necessity kind of, if, you know, for this to be a success, you either had to invest in the whole principle or it would start to fall to pieces, because yeah, a drab tarmac driveway and road surface in there, which would then probably then sort of not kind of qualify for shared surfaces in terms of kind of how you have to detail them. Everything will then sort of start to tumble apart. So I think we were quite fortunate. As a developer we've worked a few times with, so we built quite a degree of trust between ourselves in terms of what was and wasn't possible. And yeah, the figure that you kind of mentioned, the £1,500 a square metre, that is literally like an undoctored sort of figure, really. And it is an incredible achievement to pull that out for, you know, for those levels. Because I think, again, what needs to be borne in mind is, obviously, when Accordia raised the aspirations for all residential architecture across the country, however many years ago that was, they were £1 million houses, weren't they? So the outturn values supported design decisions and the value kind of choices that were made. Whereas sales rates here were, you know, in the £220 to £300 a square foot range. So, you know, so it had to kind of be made to kind of work for those levels. So, I mean, I suppose I tried to illustrate, there's a whole lot of money spent on the front of those houses and the key details, and then like a very simple kind of palette used kind of elsewhere, kind of really. But again, even things like the Lindab rise and fall gutters, which are an extra over, aren't they, above like a normal kind of gutter treatment. The developer bought into the principle that they added value and quality to them and was willing to kind of spend that and kind of work harder to save money elsewhere. So yeah, I'd say the public realm was just as important as the houses, really, and I think the developer also believed that.
Yeah, I think we've got a question here, but it's the same thing I was thinking is, how did you achieve, I mean, he says, what a beautiful project. How did you achieve the deep sloping brick in the reveal? I mean, you know, those are the kind of things that end up just getting value engineered out. How do you manage to keep those in?
Well,
and that was actually, assuming it's brick slips anyway, how is it done?
Yeah, no, it's a brick slip system. It's a Corium Wienerberger system kind of tied back to a gallows bracket effectively. So actually really quite simple. So the way in which that was achieved was quite a lot of hard work by ourselves to make it as simple to build as possible. And in essence, it came down to very little more than a couple of very normal lintels with the Corium brick slip kind of sat kind of in the center of it, really. And because we were ordering 30 of them, it kind of made some sense, really. Like it wasn't an exceptional expense, but it was perceived to add huge value. Now, we did look at taking that out and just making that a cladding material, you know, a grey panel, say, you know, whether that's aluminium, zinc, whatever it kind of might have ended up being. But again, as soon as the brickwork started to go up, it was clear how much quality that tactile nature added to the whole scheme, and just again softened the whole thing, because it's quite a if the materials weren't as sensitively handled, that could be quite a harsh looking development, really. But I think all those bits helped to kind of to make it work, really. And I would say, yeah, probably a lot of hard work by us to actually make it a simple detail to build in the first place was probably key to that.
Were you saying that detail actually changed during the construction of the development?
No. So it started with the intent of being that, and
Right.
and when we were talking about all the issues to do with kind of the value engineering, the kind of making budgets kind of work, the ease of construction, that was a discussion that was had in terms of, would that simplify things? Would that make it quicker to build? The bricklayers are off site, you bring somebody else in, you can close things up. But again, it was probably just a very open conversation where we kind of talked about the relative benefits. But then, as I say, just made it as simple as possible to kind of construct, really. It's almost like a decoration after kind of the facade of the building, really.
Yusuf here was asking a question: how did it actually? How long did it take you to get this through planning permission?
A long time, actually. Not necessarily because of the architecture. So there were some challenges because this started a long time ago. So there were some challenges to do with the unconventional nature of the unit types, and that. Luckily, we had a good planning department who were willing to kind of look at those things, because everything's challenged. Interface distances are substandard. Things were kind of delivered differently. So we had to kind of talk very carefully through that, hence why the CGIs were produced at the time to really explain some of those details. So that aspect was actually quite okay. The highways aspect of kind of dealing with a non-standard highway was actually okay. But Bellway kind of threw us a huge curveball by not getting their road adopted and changing kind of lots of kind of how things could work. And equally, the biggest kind of hold up during the planning process was a debate on the affordable housing section 106 kind of aspects, really. Not because our client was trying to be difficult, but just because of an unrealistic expectation. I mean, you obviously have queried the £1,500 a square metre. We were told we should be building for £900 a square metre, and that should go into the viability cap. So that actually kind of results in quite a bit of delay, rather than the complexity of the scheme. Did you manage to sell it to the whole community? I'm mindful of the time here, but I mean, it is quite compelling as a project. The tenure blind nature of it. I mean, did that go down well with the developer client? Yeah, I mean, there's no two ways about it. They would clearly have preferred it to be all open market sale, wouldn't they? You know, that would be a straight equation. But no, that was a relatively straightforward process. I mean, interestingly, again, the local authority were possibly the harder party in that, because the affordable housing provider, which was Regenda, kind of in this instance, kind of wanted to do something different because they believed differently in the development. But the local authority imposed specific restrictions in terms of the proportion of rent and shared ownership properties within that. But certainly, whilst there was the normal kind of concerns about kind of does that impact on the development, it's actually proved completely unfounded, and that's been hugely well managed, I would say, by Regenda in terms of kind of tenants and residents kind of in there. So that's kind of worked quite seamlessly. Great. And just one final question quickly. And I looked at it too. Lovely looking UPVC windows there. I thought they were actually steel frame. They look so fine. How did you address ventilation issues there? They're all fixed lights. How are you getting air in there? Well, no, I did sort of mention that each of the ones that are a large fixed light, they're the dual aspect rooms that have an opening light kind of. So they've got another window on the side elevation that deals with but also there is MVHR across a number of those units as well. So there's a number of different solutions. Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed. Lovely project, Dave. Thank you very much for showing it to us. Okay, welcome. Hope you managed to get a couple more, more projects along that line. You're clearly developing a niche in it. Congratulations, well done. Thank you. We need to move on now to our next sponsor presentation.
This is from James Lloyd of Wonder, or Wonder. I would say Wonder because I don't know if they're German or not, but otherwise Wonder. James is a underfloor heating designer and supplier at Wonder's technical team, and joined it 5 years ago as frontline support, where his passion for decarbonising and making the heating industry more efficient was recognised. James is responsible for training new employees and managing the technical team, and he's also specification consultant at Wonder. Is it Wonder?
Yeah, it's Wonder. We're Welsh,
okay.
not German.
Wonder, and he engages directly with architects and specifiers to ensure that they're specifying the best products for the job. His talk is on zero carbon. Are radiators the best solution? And considering I'm thinking about changing my heating, take it away, James.
Yeah, no trouble. So obviously, like I said, the presentations, carbon zero radiator is the best solution. Obviously, with the new sort of Part L changes coming in, which I'll talk about in a bit, especially as we're renovating, extending and building new houses, we do need to be mindful of the way that we're heating our houses. And obviously, with a focus on net carbon zero, radiators have been sort of the standard solution for quite a while, and we're just really looking to interrupt that trend. There's something, we did a bit of research, there's about 8,000 planning permissions approved every week for just renovations and extensions under £100,000. And it's quite shocking that most of them are having radiators installed because it's what we've always done, sort of thing. So if we just take a look at why radiators have been used in the past, the modern radiator, the Bundy radiator that you can see on the right there, sort of introduced in the 1870s, just as a luxury for homes that were heated by open fires. And then we've used them as the go-to because we got used to the quick heat up times and the low cost of gas. And then around the 1960s, obviously we had Roman hypercausts before, a long time ago, even in sort of what's now North Korea in sort of 5000 BC. But around the 1960s, we saw sort of underfloor heating as we know it today in screed, buried with a pipe sort of under 75 mil of screed typically. And it was fine when it was in large areas such as airports and sports halls where you'd need a consistent heat throughout the day. So it was pretty much always on, powered by a low temperature sort of boiler typically, but it didn't work too well in the modern homes. Just because the heating requirement can change throughout the day, people pop in and out, and you might have invested sort of 6 hours of energy into that system to leave after 2 hours and still have it sort of heating the house for 4 hours after. So just got a bad reputation as, you know, being expensive to run and having to have it on all the time, and you know, you'd have to open windows when you were getting too warm. But obviously, like we were saying, with the new standards, we know that sort of home heating accounts for about 31% of our CO2 emissions. And with the net zero targets and how high fuel costs are getting now especially, we do need to think about more efficient ways to heat our homes, both for the planet and our wallets. So with the changes to Part L, obviously there's been quite a few changes, but the most relevant ones as far as we're concerned with heating the home really, making sure that we're designing systems to sufficiently heat the dwelling with a maximum flow temperature of about 55 degrees Celsius. And the home is going to need to produce at least 75% lower carbon emissions and 31% less carbon dioxide than the current sort of 2013 standards will allow. So the best advice I can really give is, no matter what you're doing, especially in a renovation or an extension, is to make changes that are going to let you turn down the supply temperature from the heat source. So whether that's an existing boiler, whether you're replacing it or installing a heat pump, if you can make changes that will let you reduce that temperature, you're going to be sort of on the path to heating that house more efficiently and reducing sort of the carbon footprint. So the first advice I give when anybody asks me is to first look at reducing the heat losses. Once you've done that, then you consider what your primary system heating is, which, like I said, is typically radiators at the moment, and the way that you're heating the water, which is typically a boiler. And then finally, once you've sort of reduced the heat losses and changed that up, then you can look at zoning the house appropriately. Those three things together will generally net the sort of greatest reduction in the flow temperature, and obviously a reduction in sort of energy usage then as well. So as we know, when you're looking at reducing heat losses, it's sort of the typical things that we're used to. So insulating the property better with the cavity wall insulation, insulating lofts and things like that. Making sure we've got primary, double and triple glazing, especially if we're dealing with older properties, sort of 1930s or even up to sort of the 1950s. And then considering secondary glazing, if it's appropriate, reducing drafts, all those sort of things are going to reduce the heat losses, as we know. And in new build houses as well, even though they're built to modern standards and already have quite low heat losses, if there is the option to reduce that further, if the budget will allow, then it is sort of going to pay dividends down the line. So it's just worth doing at that stage when you are building it, so that you're not having to go back after the fact if you're looking to make it more efficient. So if we move on to the primary heating system and the hot water source. So typically, once your heat losses have been reduced and we're ready to talk about moving away from radiators and high temperature water sources, and then start looking at solutions like underfloor heating with a low flow temperature, which you can get from a boiler. We have mixing valves on manifolds and things like that to deal with the temperature differences. Or if you're dealing with a modern heat pump, which you'll be dealing with 30 to 45 degrees Celsius heat typically. We know that radiators today typically will rely on very hot water around 70 degrees Celsius and convection currents to heat the space, which we can see illustrated on the right. That'll typically mean that the walls and the ceiling above the radiator get hot before the other side of the room begins to heat, because we're relying on those convection currents. Whereas, you can alternatively, oversize them to deal with the low temperature water. But then it's got to be on for a very long period of time is the caveat of that. Whereas if we look at underfloor heating, on the other hand, because we're dealing with the whole surface area of the floor, we're achieving sort of an even spread of heat throughout the room from the ground, and then by the time it reaches the ceiling, it's already emitted most of the energy into the room and it's cooling down. So you actually get the hot air where you're actually living, rather than heating the ceiling first and then the space that you live in. So with that large surface area and a low profile system, like we have a system we call Wondertherm, which you might be able to see behind me, that sits directly below the final floor finish, something like a tile. So with that large surface area and how close it is to the floor finish, you can actually tend to get the room heating in 30 minutes, even with the low temperature water, sort of 35 Celsius. So you can use that then with a boiler, a heat pump, whatever your solution is in that particular project, and still achieve that rapid response that we're used to with radiators without having to use that very hot water. So if you've already then decided with the client that you are looking at underfloor heating, the next step is making sure you're using the correct system for the application, really. So you'll typically, there are quite a few different systems depending on the exact situation you're dealing with, but most of the time you'll either be dealing with a screed system or what's generally called an overfloor system or an overlay system. So the basic differences between the two is the screed will heat up. It takes at least 6 hours, but I've seen ones that can take up to 3 days to heat up, whereas an overfloor system will generally heat up in, like I said, our system heats up in about 30 minutes. The screed system, especially in a renovation, can be quite expensive to retrofit if you're having to dig up floors. Obviously, an overfloor system lays directly over the top, and because of that, it can also be fitted to a new build sort of house. As you can see at the bottom of the slide there, you can see the sort of the key advantages and disadvantages of each system. There are, of course, it's becoming more niche now because the overfloor system is making the screed system quite redundant in a lot of cases. It reacts quicker, and usually the only trade-off is you're spending a bit more money. But in niche cases, like in care homes and airports and things like that, where you might want a consistent sort of temperature in every room throughout all times of the day, then a screed system can be more beneficial because of the lower sort of install cost typically. The next thing to consider is the diameter of the pipe, which is quite important when you're choosing the system. A smaller diameter pipe needs to be spaced much closer together to achieve the same output of a larger diameter pipe, because there's less surface area in contact with the conductive materials, essentially. So I put some information together on the bottom there. As you can see, with a 16mm pipe, you can get about 100 linear meters out of a run, which will give you about 15 meters squared because of that maximum length, and the pipe spacings can be slightly further apart. Whereas when you're dealing with something like a 10mm pipe, the internal resistance of the pipe is much higher, so the pump will struggle to push that water around if you go too far with the pipe. That mixed with the fact that you've got to go quite close together with the pipe centers, you'd only be looking at about 4 meters squared out of a run. The key takeaway there really is that a larger bore pipe with the appropriate centers is going to give you more output. And because you end up putting less pipe in the floor but still getting that same output, it's going to give you sort of a lower cost of install overall for the project, which obviously can be quite desirable, especially over large areas. If you're doing more than just 1 or 2 rooms, that'll add up quite quick when you start to have to consider sort of secondary and tertiary manifolds and things like that. So then we move on to zoning. So, once you've reduced the heat losses and you've specified your appropriate heating solution, then you just need to consider how you're going to control the system. So what you find typically in new homes is that it's a requirement to have at least 2 zones where you're zoning your upstairs and your downstairs on separate thermostats, which already provides you a huge benefit versus heating the entire house just because you want the living room warm. But you can take it a step further. Obviously, you can use quite simple controls to control underfloor heating, and typically those will give you sort of 4 or 5 on and off periods throughout the day, and you can zone that room by room. And to take it further again, if you want to go for a smart system, we've actually developed our own system because none of anything that was on the market didn't really suit what we think you needed. So we've made our own system to deal with underfloor heating, but it also deals with radiators. And that'll essentially just allow you to control your room by room, and then you get about 48 different sections throughout the day to turn the temperature up and down, so you can have the heat sort of where you want it and when you want it, rather than sort of trying to predict when you're going to be hot or cold. And also just enable you to really fine-tune the control so you can have the bedroom at different temperatures throughout the night, so that when you get into bed you can have it a little warmer than when you're sleeping, and then heat it up again obviously when you're getting up in the morning. Doing that and just heating the rooms that you're actually going to be using is then going to again further allow you to reduce the sort of load that you're putting on your heat source, and also then obviously drastically cut the energy usage and the emissions. I think I've cut it a bit short really because I've run through that quite quickly, but it's sort of in conclusion that the key things to take away is that the wet heating systems should now be designed, especially with the changes to Part L, with a maximum flow temperature of 55 Celsius or lower, and that radiators should no longer really be the go-to option with modern floor heating systems sufficiently able to heat the space with a lower flow temperature. And obviously a low profile, rapid response zoned underfloor heating system should be considered for your next project. I've just realized as well, I think it sort of flew straight past the Part L slide. So if I just quickly go back through here. Yeah, here we go, the relevant changes. And just again, just to show what the changes are going to be from the 15th of June in 2022. So we're obviously expecting, with the decarbonisation of the energy grid, we're probably going to be moving away from gas-powered heating over to the heat pumps. And like I said earlier, with the section 510 stating that we need to be designing it to a 55 Celsius or lower and providing that 75% lower carbon emission and 31% less carbon dioxide. Those are the key considerations when you are building the new sort of houses and also renovating and extending existing. And then, of course, if you would like to get in touch with us at all, we do have a team there. We've got a technical team, and you can give us a ring. And if you are interested in any specifications, CVDs or workshops, I am able to provide those in my emails on screen. But really, if there are any Q&As, I'd be happy to take those now, really.
Thank you very much, James. Questions from me. I'm obviously really thick in terms of my understanding of underfloor heating systems, because the idea that you can kind of control each individual room, like bedrooms, obviously want to be cooler than main living spaces and stuff. I'm really dumb, and I just assume the pipes, the whole system is just kind of like being run through with the same hot water. But are you saying that you actually have little kind of like switch offs that actually divert the water or switch it off so it only runs through certain rooms in order to keep different rooms at different temperatures?
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I run through that a bit quick because I'm very aware of the time.
I'm an idiot, so I don't, I'm not.
Yeah, you essentially end up with something called a manifold, which will run the pipe individually to each room. So you might have one. So with the area size, you might have 2 loops of pipe in a 30-meter squared living room, for example. You connect your thermostat up to the appropriate controls on the manifold, and you would essentially, especially through the app, you just simply tell the app and the thermostat that you want loops 1 and 2 to open for the living room, for example. So it'll turn your boiler on, it'll turn the pump on, but it'll only open up those 2 loops. So you keep your kitchen, your hallway, your bathroom and all that off, because you might not want the heat at that time.
So that's all done, that would be done at early stages when you're actually designing the system itself. You're kind of making these decisions. Yeah.
Yeah. So we design the systems ourselves, and we're able to design it essentially how the clients want it to make sure that they are able to get the control we want. We're also working on a bit of software that will enable architects to design that themselves as well, really, to empower them to make it exactly how they want the system to be for their clients, so that if they've got if they want a massive sort of open area to be zoned into separate sections, so they can have the living room section with the warm floor whilst keeping the kitchen cool, they can do that. So it's, as long as you get it right at the design stage, it's really quite easy to get the zone in exactly how you want it.
I've got Timothy Slater here asking a couple of questions. Will it work with an electric boiler, and is it a wet system? Well, I think clearly it's a wet system, but will it work with an electric boiler?
Yeah, definitely. I always tell people, as long as you're producing hot water, we can use it. So obviously electric boilers, you need to be considering the cost of the electricity. Most of the time, if you consider an electric boiler, I'd consider something like a heat pump because of the efficiency on them. But it'll work with any hot water source at all, no matter sort of what temperature you're producing. If it's low temperature, we can use it straight off the back. If it's high temperature, you'll typically mix that water down to a more acceptable temperature so that the tile doesn't get uncomfortable.
Well, going on from the electric boiler and costs, I was talking last week with an architect who was talking about his terrible experience of trying to get any money back from the renewable heat incentive when he was installing an air source heat pump. Can you give us any insights really into the whole clean heat grant? I mean, that's turning up in April. I'm sure a lot of people are interested in, if there are grants going to be made for air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps. How easy do you think this is going to be implemented? And do you feel there's going to be a real kind of draw by consumers to take it with take-up of these technologies?
Yeah, I think it'll be quite a big take-up on it, really. So we had a bit of an issue with the Green Homes Initiative, because you had to have things like you had to have the loft insulation, you had to have the double glazing, and all those sort of things ticked off before you would say they were sort of all primary, and then things like your heating system were considered secondary. So it'd be interesting to see exactly how it works. But I think if nothing else, if you're getting an incentive on a heat pump, it makes sense that you want to put in a system that will allow that heat pump to work efficiently. We're not involved with heat pumps, but I know that they have a coefficient of performance that tends to be around 2.7 or 4 at a maximum end, which means that you put in sort of 1 unit of electricity and you can get up to 4 units of heat out of it. So if you get and they operate more efficiently at the lower temperatures. If you're trying to put 50 Celsius water through it, they don't operate as efficiently. Whereas if you can put 30, 35 through, it'll allow you to get closer to that sort of golden figure of sort of coefficient of 4. So putting in a system that's compatible and allow you to get a quick heat up time at those low flow temperatures, sometimes even as low as 30 degrees Celsius in modern houses, even if for whatever reason you aren't applicable to get it with the heating system, getting it on an appropriate heat pump and using the right heating system is still going to sort of help you a lot in saving costs.
Okay. I'm just going to forward you a couple of questions. We've got one from Lewid, which is, when retrofitting underfloor heating as an existing concrete floor using overlay system with no insulation, it's a 1970s build in brackets, can you lay a membrane sheet to reduce heat loss? And the second question, can an overfloor system be used on an existing timber floor? What options would you have to finish the system?
Yeah, I think it was muted then. So if I address the timber floor, so the general rule of thumb, it can be fitted to any structural subfloor. And my rule of thumb is you'd want to be happy to tile on top of it before you put the system down. So if you fitted it to a timber floor, you just want to remove as much bounce as possible. You know, if your timber's flexing like that, then the tile's going to pop, and it's the same for the system. You want to make sure that it's sort of sturdy before you do anything to it.
You can put an engineered timber floor system on top of it, then, can't you?
Yeah, you can put engineered timber directly on top of it. You can also put tile directly on top of it. You can use a renovation screed. I've actually got an example behind me, just with literally a laminate straight on top of it. And then as far as it goes with the concrete floor, like I said, it does have to be bonded to a structural floor finish. So using a membrane underneath it, I would be concerned about sort of a slip in between the layers. So you would want to bond it directly to the concrete. Our board in particular is made out of polystyrene though, so it does add a bit of insulation for you in that situation, where some people are using things like gypsum, which is just going to conduct the heat down into the concrete. So it's just making sure, if that is the situation and you can't insulate further, just making sure you choose a product that's going to actually prevent that sort of downwards heat loss as much as possible.
And just one final question from Tarek. God forbid my words, but he's asking maintenance requirements.
Yeah, so my advice to people is always to make sure set up some sort of deal with your plumber, where maybe when they're servicing the boiler, they'll come and have a look at the system. I recommend a visual inspection every 6 months, and if you start to see any weeps or leaks on it at all, just we've got a technical team in 6 days a week, and as soon as you send us a photo in, we'll identify exactly what you need and typically get it out next day. So it's just a case of keeping an eye on your system and making sure that as soon as you see anything that might be a bit suspect, it's just get on the phone and find out what it is and what you need to do. Because if you can change a radiator, or if you can bleed a radiator, you can usually do most of the things that you need to do to maintain the system.
It does strike me that if you put a floor system on top of it, then you really don't want to be pulling it all up in order to kind of like deal with leaks or anything, though, really.
No, I mean, our stuff's all guaranteed for 50 years. We've never had a leak in a pipe. The most you get is somebody might put a screw through it, and we've got repair couplings for those situations. But all the maintenance is done at the manifold. There's no joins under the floor. So it's all it's essentially a wall on the wall mounted, similar to a radiator, and that's where you perform all of the maintenance.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much indeed, James. Pleasure talking to you. Hopefully an innovation or a system we're going to see a lot more of in the next few years, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. I think so.
Thank you very much. Our final architect speaker today is going to be speaking on the Eddington key worker housing in Cambridge. And it's presented by Kauri Orsugi, Stanton Williams Architects. Kauri is director at Stanton Williams and an award-winning architect who works with clients, stakeholders and local communities to help them unlock the social and spatial potential of any site. She gained experience in the UK and internationally and joined Stanton Williams in 2004. And since then, she's been responsible for several high-profile projects, many of which are considered benchmarks for sustainability and placemaking, such as this Sterling Prize shortlisted key worker housing in northwest Cambridge. It's obviously a city she knows well. She's a member of the Greater Cambridge Design Review Panel, which I'm sure came in handy when she was working on this.
I wasn't yet then. I just joined.
The Eddington Key Worker Housing is 264 key worker code for sustainable home level 5 designed homes for university staff, supported by generous public realm of courts and squares, retail and social spaces that echo the collegiate forms of the university itself. Very much look forward to hearing this one. You've got the stage, Kauri. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you, Carlos. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see this?
Yeah, that's great.
Great, thank you. I can't see anybody, so I'm going to try and talk as quickly as possible. The pressure of 15 minutes. So this is one of our residential projects at Eddington in northwest Cambridge. And the project is a part of a completely new urban development by the University of Cambridge. And then the location is sort of shown in red here. It's about a 15-minute cycle ride from the Cambridge city centre. The main part of the development is residential. It provides affordable accommodations for the university's growing number of researchers and staff, which is instrumental in maintaining the university's long-term success, and while dealing with kind of problems arising from Cambridge and local housing prices and shortages. So the site used to be a university's farmland. It's a photograph before the development. I won't go into this, but the master plan was designed by AECOM, and this sort of plan shows the kind of first phase of the development, and that contains sort of schools and hotels, affordable housing, market housing, community centre, and so on. And then our site here is sort of shown in red. And then, as Carlos said, it contains 264 affordable homes for the university's key workers. together with the multifunctional social spaces for the residents, retail facility, some university offices, and then spread over 10 buildings. And then central to the development was a very high sustainability aspirations by the university. And the brief was to provide and then advocate exemplar in sustainable living. So brief was to achieve the Code of Sustainable Homes Level 5. It is the single largest Code 5 development in the country. They included obviously a very high performing facade, things like site-wide district heating network and PVs, very high levels of daylight and views to all apartments, responsible source of materials. And longevity and adaptability was obviously very important. You know, buildings was to stay there, but also be adaptable. All apartments were designed to lifetime homes, and the primary structure was designed to 120 years and a kind of flexibility in mind. 120 years, so. The development as a whole has a pioneering rainwater management strategy, and it is the largest stormwater recycling scheme in the country then. And the biodiversity is obviously a very big part of the development and with access to nature. So, but you know, it's all very great, but the main challenges we felt was the designing the blocks of flats in a new urban development with high sustainability targets often means that the building form tends to be quite simple to achieve a good form factor. And the roofs are flat to accommodate like kind of things like water attenuation, PVs, and biodiversity measures. And there was like a ratio of building footprint to landscape, meant that the buildings are mostly so 5 stories to achieve the brief. And the buildings are quite more sort of spaced apart, generally about 20 meters, in order to provide high level of daylight and views. So we thought it could lack intimacy and in character, you know, kind of sense of space that are often found in the traditional cities. So anyway, our general kind of principle, of course, it was that the design needed to be for individuals, you know, their well-being and well-designed apartments and sense of security and belongings. But the design also needed to be for the community we are creating, you know, how we could create spaces that encourage social interactions and promote new sustainable community. It is also, you know, of course, part of a city, although it's all new, it is a part of the wider placemaking, and our site could not be looked in isolation. So as part of a design approach, we looked for opportunities to break down the scale of buildings by introducing kind of human scale elements like garden walls and landscaping, cycle stands, and how we could bring some intimacy and permeability in this new environment. And we were inspired by the quality of spaces, as Carlos mentioned, that are found in Cambridge colleges. The network of communal spaces, you know, of different scale and character, and the informal relationships and kind of transitional between spaces that we found very attractive. And we wanted to capture that kind of sort of quality within our design. They also often have a sort of progression of character from the formal urban court, often kind of front court, to more informal natural settings. So as we always do, we always sort of start off playing with models and sketches, trying to understand the kind of spaces we were trying to create, not only for our site in isolation, but sort of how the spaces relate with the surrounding context and how people may move in and around the site. So this is a kind of sort of conceptual diagram of our design approach. We put our design focus on communal spaces and then experiences of them. So in our approach, kind of buildings are then sort of placed really to frame those spaces. So the spaces come first. This is an aerial photo, a view of our site model. And then it kind of shows the kind of networking of interconnecting courtyards we created, including the kind of neighboring spaces. So the sequence of spaces we created relate to each other in informal manner, but intends to express kind of different social interactions. So the progression of spaces like goes from urban public square called Market Square, which is kind of this on the right. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but which is the heart of the whole development, through to the semi-public landscape court. So the main amenity space, you know, that becomes the heart of the new community. So it kind of becomes public to be a little bit more private. So that during the design process, we evaluated quite a lot the scale and character of spaces we are creating using references in physical models. So for instance, the Market Square, this is the main public square again, itself was designed by Townsend Landscape, but the sort of framing of this space was by us. So, and then we saw the space as a kind of flexible public space, but also as well as a kind of urban living room for the residents. And then social court, which is sort of the next space in, links to the multifunctional sort of social facilities. It's also a flexible space, but a bit smaller in scale and more for the residents. And the character, it's a little quieter and less public than the Market Square. So we quite like some of the German courtyards and so on. The arrival courts that we created is either sort of where the residents arrive by their bikes or by foot. So most residents cycle every day here, and it is a key part of the everyday experience. There are more than 550 cycle spaces in total within our scheme. So we felt that kind of act of arrival and then parking the bikes is an opportunity for social interaction. And then it really should be celebrated as a part of a sustainable living activity. And then so we created a single-story cycle pavilions that contribute to breaking down the building scale, and then together with the garden walls, introduce human scale and the meandering routes between the buildings. But then the cycle pavilions are more generous in size, and then it's a pleasant space with a kind of central planting and then, place to sit should the residents bump into a fellow residents. So in a way, they were treated for us like another communal court for the residents to interact. That's a kind of main part of this whole composition of the communal spaces. And then kind of final space is the landscape court, which is the largest court. It is a main amenity space for the residents, and it is sort of as a heart of a new community, really. It is still accessible by the public, but the character is more secure and then private with a sort of more naturalistic landscape. So things like we have a fruiting plant on the south-facing facade and nuttery plant on the north. So things like that not only contribute, of course, to the biodiversity, but create more interaction for the residents. We worked very closely with J&L Gibbons Landscape in developing the scheme, and the landscape strategy would heavily really influence the overall concept and how the community spaces and buildings are kind of interacted. Another key element of the design is the water management for both sustainable urban drainage and recycling strategies. The site topography falls around about 4.5 meters over its length, so about 240 meters. And we saw this as an opportunity to express the surface water being collected. So this is the main route. Orange line here shows the main route, so direct routes through the site. And along this, we introduce cobbled wheels that collect and carry surface water across the site. So all the sort of levels falls towards it. The water is then terminated in the pond at the bottom of the landscape court, which is kind of shown in the biggest blue square there. And then it's attenuated there and then discharged into the site-wide lagoon, and then it's recycled for toilets and washing machines and so on. It is a big part of this sustainable development, and we felt that, again, it should be celebrated, and let it really be part of the day-to-day experience, rather than normally kind of hide it all below ground. That's a feature. Just quickly for the PiP purpose, the roof is a blue roof by Almask, and then that's store and then attenuate surface water on the roof level. And we put a brown roof with a kind of crushed recycled brick aggregate, and for that biodiversity, then place the PV panels. It's full of PV panels. So the roof is doing a lot of work. And this just shows a model showing the ground floor of the kind of final design. This model was made really as a working model for us to understand the relationship between the spaces, movement of people, routes, permeability into spaces and buildings. The ground floor is much more animated to enhance the day-to-day experiences. And the materials used were also much more tactile and warm, because that's where you experience the closest, which you will see in some photographs in a moment. The upper floor, so the residential blocks, are then placed on the top. They're simple urban volumes with simple material palette. The volumes are then often placed very corner to corner, close to each other, to create a moment of compression and an intimacy without compromising the daylight into apartments. We don't have time today to go through the facade design today, but just to say that the facade treatment is highly articulated with deep window reveals and brick piers. This not only animated elevations, but also accommodate high level of insulation, and together with the sort of projecting sills, they contribute to solar shading. And perhaps more interestingly, they're just not only decorational items. The facade is a self-supporting, and the piers and reveals provide its own structural support, so allowing the facade to be independent of the building frame and eliminating the risk of thermal bridging. And I'm just going to take you through some of the photographs of the finished buildings. This is the market and the spaces. The market square, as I said, is the main urban square for the development with public activities. And then this market square is a bit quieter there, again, looking towards the threshold between urban square and then residential. This is the first courtyard on the left, social court, which is to the left. So we created kind of this series of undercuts. We introduced these things that kind of create a human scale threshold between spaces as you move through, and then bring a sense of discovery to the experience. They also allow the spaces to feel enclosed while maintaining the informal permeability between public and semi-public spaces. The water pool on the left is where the expression of water starts. Then adjacent to it on the right, on the ground, is the kind of cobbled reveals. That's where it starts. I don't know if you can see, and then that's carrying the surface water towards the landscape court. This is one of the arrival courts with the cycle pavilion on the right, and the building entrance, one of the building entrances, which is deliberately kind of kept small and human scale with the warm timber. Cobbled surface in the landscape on the ground, and adds to the sort of tactile, sort of warm experience. This is inside one of the cycle pavilions. The plants and trees have grown a lot since this photograph was taken, but it kind of sort of shows this feeling of somewhere that you can nest if it needs to be. The timber screen to the cycle pavilions, the painted black, provides a level of permeability for security, but also acts as a kind of lantern in the night. So cycle pavilion from the top, it also has a diverse blue roof. Just again, in terms of product, for the black timber, we use the Falan paint. It's a mineral-based paint that allows to breathe and preserve the wood. The same paint often used for those sort of very old paint, and often used for kind of a traditional red houses in Sweden, you might have seen. It's supposed to have a lifespan of 10 to 15 years with a minimum or no maintenance, because obviously maintenance is a very big issue for the university. From the inside of one of the residential entrances, it's a lot of natural light and views to the courtyard, which are important. The brick paver in the landscape is carried through to the internal, so the merging threshold between external and internal of communal spaces. So and then inside this communal space is the staircase, and then we introduce a quite strong color, intended to express that communal stay is still part of the social experience. So coming out again is the most threshold into the next space, and the tactile sort of brickwork, warm brickwork is on a lower plinth level. And then from one of the arrival courts, looking towards the landscape court, and hopefully these shots convey that the experience is kind of very much the focus on the ground, lower human levels. It's the landscape court, the main amenity space, as I said, for the community. It's much more open green space, but with a sense of sort of secure enclosure. And again, it's a landscape court. If there's no water in there, so the bottom of it is actually that attenuation pond that we created for the water management. Few internal shots. It's a lot of light. Most apartments are dual aspect, and when there's only few apartments that are not. All the apartment layouts are measured to make sure made it shallower to make sure there's enough light and views from every space. And it's quite a generous apartments. Spaces are kind of based on the London Housing Guide. And a simple palette of materials, really, mainly ready for the wider maintenance reasons by the university, for the university. Just to say, again, we use the steel bathroom pots for all apartments, which is by Walker Modular. Coming out again, looking back from landscape court, and just finally just arrival court in evenings, and then it's another sort of arrival court in the evening. That's it from me. Sorry, I talked very quickly, but hopefully I made sense there.
Thank you very much indeed, Kauri. It was a lovely presentation and a beautiful building. The build quality is self-evident, really, just going through those photos. I was kind of interested. I mean, there's a question here from Rob, who says, how did you ensure the new development was integrated into the idea of university and non-university communities? Many university developments seem quite separate from the city, creating a divide. But I'd probably add to that question, looking at the way that you've kind of got this idea of public, going through from public to semi-public and more private on the inner parts of the development, how did you kind of work with, I mean, I'm assuming you work with organizations like Secured by Design, who probably are very much keen on the idea of kind of individual security, and it feels to me like you can just move through this site. And I wonder, how do you deal with issues of security, well-being for people, for the residents there? Obviously, you mentioned things like having permeable screens for bike sheds and stuff, so that, you know, there's visibility on both sides. But how did you deal with very real issues of kind of maintaining security on the site and people's own sense of well-being and safety, and maintain the architectural aspiration to just keep it as open as possible for people to move?
Yes, it was our aspiration to keep it permeable, but also it was the university's aspiration that all the spaces are, and the planners councils to keep it publicly accessible. So, but still we wanted to keep the residents to feel a bit more secure. So the kind of transition of space that was intended to sort of have a sense of a bit more of a private and a bit more secure space. And that was a kind of first sort of tryout to see, you know, Cambridge is not the highest crime place. We worked with the Secured by Design officers and so on as well. But if worst comes to worst, which hopefully not, and hasn't happened in the last 2 years that buildings opened, is that if the security becomes an issue, there's an option of having a gated development, which ideally, you know, nobody wants that.
No.
But there is that flexibility that we left in our design as well. But it is a kind of sort of feeling of it in a protected sort of environment. Another thing is that, for instance, the landscape court, the main amenity space, or the living spaces overlooking that space. It's just a kind of bit more visual connection and, you know, sort of security again over the people being overlooking of the sort of kind of residents keeping an eye on things. So that kind of sort of we measure that.
Passive observance and stuff.
These things. So it's all kind of integrated in that sort of sense of place language. And in terms of sort of general public and so on, again, it's generally accessible, and there's quite a lot of market housings being sold and then also being built in the site. There's a school and then a community center which is open to public as well for the university. Market Square, they're sort of trying to have a bit more activity. To be honest, a lot of retailers are not open yet. The pandemic hasn't helped, so they slow down the whole thing. So we're hopeful that once that's open, and maybe more public would access to the site, also the development. So it is, although quite a lot of affordable housing in there. I think first phase had 700 affordable homes in total, but then we still got like 300 market housing. There's a hotel being built. So, it's all kind of for the wider community and the public as well.
Yeah.
If that answered your question there.
I mean, it's key worker housing for, admittedly a global university. So I'm kind of interested in what lessons you take from the design of this, which I think, I would say, we mentioned at the very beginning, kind of high end for the key worker housing, sector. So what lessons do you think you could kind of bring as an organization, as a firm, to more standard generic mass housing models, for instance?
Yeah, so the quite a lot of cost. I mean, to be honest, the materiality and so on is quite simple and all that kind of things. But to be honest, a lot of cost was in the kind of longevity we talked about. Like 120 years primary structure is quite unusual for housing, and it's quite a lot of sustainability elements of that. But the lesson really is, even for much less of David mentioned earlier, but kind of cost buildings, the development, the kind of spaces that you try to create, what you prioritize, in terms for the community or for the individual, and the kind of this experiences and threshold and all those things are not necessarily to do with the cost. It's about prioritizing the right things and having the right vision and understanding how the experiences and then people move and so on. So, which we don't think it's to do with the cost or, so those things are probably the main thing. The placemaking aspect of it is the lessons learned from here.
Just a quick question here about internal areas of the units from Marianne Wren.
The areas, okay, so they're mainly 1 bedroom and 2 bedrooms flat. And 1 bedroom is kind of between 54 square meter. Then the 2 bedrooms about 62 to 64 square meter. Okay. There's some 4 bedroom kind of cluster arrangements too, but they were more like student arrangement. Yeah.
And Tarek is asking a question here. Thank you for this great scheme. Who's responsible for maintenance of the shared areas?
It's the university, university appointed the dedicated maintenance team for the whole of the development, which is very quite good, really. And then in terms of managing the development, gosh, what are they called? They changed. MEES, maybe. Sorry, I can't remember. But yes, so there's a single maintenance team that maintains it.
Management.
There's a bit of an. I didn't show today. It's got a bit of roof terrace elements and so on, because not all. Some of the apartments are quite far from the main amenity landscape court. So there's got the roof terraces and so on in there, as well as in the landscape court. There's an element, kind of allotment, small allotment area and so on for the residents to enjoy. So those are by the residents, but the main part is by the university, which is good in that you can kind of get a feedback, which is a collective feedback from the sort of development as well as your site, your own sort of design. So.
Oh, well, thank you very much indeed. It was a great presentation. Sorry you had to rush you through it.
I hope I wasn't speaking too fast.
No. It's just it's a shame, because these 15-minute things, I still managed to overrun, God knows how, but it just doesn't seem long enough really for most of these projects. There's so many things to say about them. But thank you very much indeed for your time, Cowley. It was really nice. It was a great presentation. Well done on the Sterling Prize shortlisted project. And yes, I suppose now it's just me to finish up. I'd like to thank all our speakers once again. But I suppose that just my final thoughts on it really is really that after the pandemic, I suppose, I'm just wondering, having seen all these projects, whether planners might, and given the pandemic, whether planners might kind of revisit LiveWorks sui generis status, really, and so that we can finally build on the hideousness of the last 2 years and those experiences. And, with Ed talking about flooding, that we obviously need to clearly address climate change issues, carbon targets from 2030 to 2050, not least now gas prices have gone up in the way that they have. And so I also hope there'll be kind of greater awareness of operational rather than just embodied carbon. And actively teaching users of these low carbon buildings to actually use less. We've clearly seen exemplar approaches here from our speakers to particular societal groups such as key workers, quality residential development, and comfortably later years developments, all of which have been carried off with skill and aplomb. Crosby amazingly on that low budget of £1,500 a square metre. But in the absence of full-scale council house building programmes, it probably gives me hope that in these specific housing challenges, they can be solved with the client's will and design skill, because it's only really political bravery that can truly address housing need. And I imagine we're probably going to have to wait a little longer for that. I'd like to thank all our speakers, Ed Barsley of the Environmental Design Studio, Steve Jones of Coffey Architects, DK Architects Dave Dickerson, and our last speaker Stanton Williams Kauriosugi, as well as our event sponsors. That'll be Jonathan Lowy from VM Zinc, Wonders James Lloyd, and Oscar Acoustics Ben Hancock. I'd like to thank you all very much indeed for staying on half an hour, you lucky people. It was 45 minutes I think the first time. And hopefully you'll all be here for our next PiP webinar on education buildings, which will be on the 15th of March 2022. And at 11:59, we can sign off. Thank you very much indeed for your time.